And we're live. Friends from around the world, welcome to Sulha. Our aim is to reconcile between people in conflict and provide a nuanced and more in-depth understanding of complex issues. Our main focus is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Me being an Israeli, this is the issue that's important to me. These are the people that we try to reconcile with. For those joining us for the first time, it's great to have you here. For those not joining us for the first time, it's also great to have you here. Earlier this week, activist and journalist Abby Martin put out a video called Debunking Israel's Human Shield Defense in Gaza Massacre. The problem is that Abby's claims are filled with lies and misinformation. So today we're going to debunk her debunking. For those who know us know that we welcome with open arms criticism of governments and institutions, but we also value honesty and integrity in our reporting. This simply was not present in Abby's recent video. It's also worth noting that Abby didn't list a single source for the many claims she made. We're going to provide sources for every claim we make in our counter this evening. The reason we decided to debunk Abby's video and not many other false claims being made is because Abby has a very large audience and many people view her as a credible source of information. People with large followings must be held accountable for spreading misinformation. Next week, we'll be debunking a pro-Israel video. We have a few in mind, but if someone comes across something they think is relevant, send it over to us and we'll check it out. Maybe that's the one we'll debunk. Before we get this show on the road, a quick shout out to our Patreon visionary members. We have Trivium Energy Pty Ltd. We have SOG Cannabis. We have Max Marine. We have Geffen Posner. We have Adam Albilia. We have Maya. And we have our one and only champion member, Raja. If you want to be a patron or support the show, find contact information in the description. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. And with that, let's get started. Friends, just please introduce yourselves. We really, we brought together a panel of people who are all experts in fields relating to reporting, international human rights, people who I trust are going to approach this issue with as much honesty and integrity as possible. So, Tal, let's start with you. Who are you, Tal?
You're on mute.
Sorry for that. Hi and good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here. My name is Tal Hagin. I'm currently studying political science in Israel, and my passion is media analysis. I've been doing this since I was 14 years old and been trying to perfect it ever since. I go after everyone, no matter if you're a pro-Israel or anti-Israel activist or you're pro-Palestinian. In my eyes, the truth is what matters, not your agenda, and that's why I'm here tonight.
Ari.
My name is Ari.brodkey. I currently work at a think tank that specializes in analyzing Middle East education in relation to peace and cultural tolerance. And in terms of what I sort of focus on most of the time in relation to the conflict is I've taught about the conflict and the peace process at a university level. And now I'm mostly doing my own research, but also in this conversation to sort of bring in some of the political background and some of the decision-making background that goes into the things that we're going to discuss.
Walter.
Hi, so my name is Walter Benarzi. I worked in Media Watchdog NGO, and I also took part in the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross competition for international humanitarian law, which is also known as the laws of armed conflict in Israel, even though I wasn't a law student. But I wanted to expand my vision because we always hear about international law, and it's such an important part of conflict. Now, states behave in conflict, so I wanted to expand my horizons, and and I'm really glad that I did it. Now everything makes sense.
Thank you all. Before we get the show on the road, Abby, if you happen to come across this video, I just want to let you know that you are definitely invited to come on the show and have this discussion. If you do truly care about the Palestinian cause, which is without a doubt a legitimate cause, then we will have enough in common to have a good conversation. So, Abby, you're invited. We'd love to have you on the show. Let's get started.
So I think that the best way to sort of start us off is, Tal, why don't we pull up Abby's original video and we'll go in, and again, the point here is not to talk about Abby as a journalist or anything like that. It's just to really go through the information that she presents in this video and to figure out what is substantiated, what is not substantiated, and really parse our way through that.
So we're going to be stopping the video periodically as we get to each claim that we're going to be discussing.
At the time of this recording, at least 217 people have been killed by Israeli bombs in Gaza. 63 of them were children, the vast majority non-combatants. Israel has leveled resident.
Already, we have the first claim that is made by Abby. She says that at least 217 people have been killed by Israeli bombs in Gaza. Now, this source comes from the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, which is important to understand that Hamas, the organization that's in charge of Gaza, also runs the Ministry of Health. I couldn't pull up the statistic from when she pulled it up. However, I do have, just shortly after she uploaded her video, the source from the Ministry of Health. As we can see here, according to the Ministry of Health, 219 Palestinians have been killed so far, 63 children, 36 women, and 16 elderly people, while 1,530 have been injured due to ongoing Israeli attacks on Gaza. A few things that are important to understand with the tally. One, there is no differentiation between militants and civilians in this count. Neither is there a differentiation between Hamas misfires that landed in civilian areas. We're going to show you these misfires by Hamas later on in the next slide. But first, I want to focus on the claims of children, women, elderly, and men. Of course, we're not trying to justify the death of any of these type of individuals, but when you're viewing the context, when we're viewing these numbers, we have to understand the context of these numbers. In regard to the 63 children, it's important to understand that Hamas has used children, forced labor to build their tunnels, which have been used against Israel, and other types of attacks against Israel. This source comes from the Institute for Palestine Studies. You guys are happy to look it up. This was research done, I think, in 2012 or 2014. I just don't want to make a claim. 2012 or 2014, this claim came out. In regard to women and elderly, this is a little bit of a problematic thing because in a lot of conflicts, it's usually the men that go out and fight. However, this isn't the case anymore in a lot of modern conflicts. Hamas does have female militants, and also elderly people have been used against Israel, such as the woman who I described below, Fatma Oma An-Najjar. I hope I said the name right. She was a 62-year-old Palestinian woman who was armed with a suicide vest who went to the fence trying to blow up Israeli soldiers. This was an elderly woman. So in regard to women and elderly that is killed, children, women, and elderly, they are not automatically innocent. Children are innocent, of course, always, in terms of what is the connection to their deaths. Was it due to Hamas putting them in the line of danger by making them build tunnels at the same time that Israel was striking them? Or were they the perfect casualties of Hamas misfires? Or were they simply the casualties of Israeli airstrikes and Israel is responsible? In regard to the men, the majority of Hamas fighters are men. And as I said before, there is no distinction in the Ministry of Health when they're discussing the men. All they say is how many men died, 104, but they do not distinctly discuss whether it was military or not. A counter source, we reached out to people that we know personally in the IDF, and as of today, on the 20th of May, according to the IDF, 160 combatants were killed, 130 by Hamas, and 130 by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. That's according to the IDF. We have yet for an investigation, but it's important to understand that there are different sources. I also want to pull up the Ministry of Health's sources from today. As of now, they claim that 232 Palestinians have been killed. That includes 65 children, 39 women, and 17 elderly. To the next claim that's important to understand, at the moment, I'm seeing a lot of different claims on social media about how many people have actually been killed by Hamas rocket fire. However, there's no clear source. This is in regard to multiple Palestinian NGOs that weren't able to confirm whether or not Hamas rockets killed anyone. Same thing goes for the IDF and other NGOs. But in the few videos that we're going to show you here, it's important to understand that there's a good chance that Hamas rocket fire have been the result of some of these civilian casualties, sadly. According to the IDF, over 4,000 missile rockets that were fired from Hamas and the Islamic Jihad were fired at Israel, with 20 to 30% of them misfiring and landing back in Gaza. We have 4 videos from different sources. This is the top left, the top right, sorry. This shows a misfire by Hamas. As you can see, the rocket goes up and then falls back down. In the second video, this is actually from the Islamic Jihad. This is a video that they released. And if you look in the video, you'll see one of the rockets that they fire stop midair and fall down. You'll see that in a second. So this is an official video from their channel right here. If you look closely, you'll see it, that it stopped firing and it falls back to the ground, and you can actually hear the explosion. Oh, you don't actually see it because the video is too short. But if you look for the video online, I can also provide it to you. I'd be happy to afterwards. You can hear the rocket exploding as it hits the ground. Another video.
Tal,
Yeah.
I just want to interject something real quick.
Yes.
Because I know our audience is very mixed, and even if you support everything Hamas does, you support their right to resist, you support their right to target civilians given their conditions, right? Even if that's your position, that is a position that you can take and advocate for, right? It's just the framing that is disingenuous. So the way Abby framed it was making it seem she painted it to maximize the amount of civilians killed without giving greater context. What Abby could have said was, we know this many people died. We don't know how many of them were militants or not, but even the militants killed, that's unfortunate because there are militants fighting for their liberation, right? That would have been an intellectually honest claim. So again, you can take the position that Hamas has the right to do what they're doing. It's about being disingenuous in how you frame it.
I'll show you 2 more videos to further these claims. Oh, this is actually the video where you hear. This is the missile being fired from Hamas and falling down, and you should hear the explosion. And the last, this is a Gazan man in Gaza where a rocket presumably falls down, a Hamas rocket, then it explode. Back to the video.
Residential buildings, vast majority non-combatants. Israel has leveled residential buildings, towers housing international media outlets, all the roads leading to Gaza's trauma hospital, Doctors Without Borders hospital, and refugee camps. In the Al-Shati refugee camp.
You guys take it away.
So, yeah, one of the things that's really interesting in this video is one of the things that stood out to me right away is that she said that the IAF was on roads, and this was something that I hadn't heard from any other source, and it was very interesting. And then we really tried to wrap our heads around what could she be talking about, like when she says that roads have been bombed, have we seen any visual evidence of this? And the closest thing that we were able to find were images like these. Now, the roads here are very clearly destroyed, but there's a question of, what caused them. I think that, anyone who's driven near a pothole before will notice that this looks somewhat familiar. And what you're seeing here is the road caving in and not the result of an explosion. If this was the result of an explosion, then you wouldn't have concrete in the center of the crater anymore. There would be black char. The debris would be much smaller. You wouldn't have large slabs still intact. So what we're seeing here is a road collapsing, most likely from the airstrikes that Israel was carrying out against, what it claims were tunnel networks. So this would make sense as to why the roads were collapsing, because if a tunnel were to implode, then a lot of the ground in Gaza is very sandy, it's very soft, and the upper part of it would collapse as well.
Also, another claim that she makes in the video, which is, we'll go on.
Massacre.
This is afterwards. Another thing to understand is that these are recent videos by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad that they released themselves, showing them operating with weaponry and tools within these tunnels. These weapons are used against the Israeli army. You can even see them putting up the date from this last week. And this forces that these tunnels become legitimate targets for the Israeli Air Force. And therefore, one of the ways that they destroy these targets is by firing a missile that goes through the ground and destroys the tunnels, which leads to these types of collapses. Another claim that she makes further in the video, but I'm going to talk about it now simply because it's here, is she says that the Israeli Air Force has not released any information in regard to why the media tower was taken down. This is not true. At the moment, the IDF has released information only to the Pentagon. Of course, we as individuals in the public, we do not have the full information. And just as you guys are probably wondering why the IDF attacked it, I am as well, and I'm waiting for the full report to come out. Important to understand, why isn't the IDF simply releasing it? Most of the time, information that a military receives on combat zones can be classified, meaning that the information that they release could put different individuals in danger who could either be in Gaza or around Gaza, and therefore they probably are waiting for things to calm down before they release this information. However, that is completely my own opinion based on my own observations, but it's important to understand that the IDF has released information as of this moment to America, and also according to the IDF, there's a vast network of underground tunnels all throughout Gaza.
So I want to maybe chime in one more thing. I see in the comments someone said that at the time of her recording that information wasn't out. It's actually untrue. It was about, I think, 16, 17 hours before then. You already had media reporting both in the United States and in Israel saying that both the administration, the Biden administration and the Pentagon had been informed. The State Department had not yet been informed, but that information was out at the time that this video was created.
Yeah. Also, another thing, because I do see some people in the chat. Maybe they're just joining now, so they don't understand the premise of what we're doing here. This is not a pro-Israel, anti-Palestine video by any means. No. This is a video that is calling out Abby Martin for the misinformation and lies that she spread in her video. Anybody watching this, if you are pro-Palestine, you should be disturbed with what Abby Martin did, because the Palestinian cause is legitimate. We don't need to lie to strengthen the Palestinian cause. When people lie to strengthen the Palestinian cause, that is then used against the cause itself. It actually weakens the cause. So anybody who cares about Palestinians should be upset when people like Abby Martin spread this information. So keep that in mind. This is not, the goal here is not to demonize Palestinians or Palestine, or to make Israel seem like they're fine and innocent. If you watch other channels on this show, you'll see we're critical both of Israel, of Hamas, of PA. We criticize governments often, and we're pro the people of both sides. So keep that in mind when watching this.
On May 15th, camps. In the Al-Shati refugee camp massacre on May 15th, they killed 7 members of the same family huddled in their home. And in one single air raid on May 16th, they killed 42 civilians, including 10 children. Every single one of these civilian dead, Israel claims were human shields. So there's nothing to condemn. It's not their fault. It's the fault of Hamas. Nothing to answer for, no pressure to stop, no accountability. We're just supposed to take their word for it. This is repeated without question by corporate media.
This is for you.
Yeah, so I think that what's important to get into here now is, Walter, maybe you can shed some light on this specifically. When we talk about what happens when you target something and what is okay under international law, what is not okay under international law, how do you select targets within the laws of armed combat, and how do you evaluate civilian casualties when making these decisions?
Well, the first thing in IHL is that there's only one thing you can target, and those are legitimate military targets, right? You can never, under any circumstances, target civilians. Now, what you need to understand is that, of course, it's a grim reality of war. There are always civilian casualties in war. The idea is that you try to limit them. Of course, that's you need to take a lot of precautions. But one of the main rule of IHL is called the proportionality in attack. Now, when you hear proportionality, you're tempted to think, oh, they killed one of us, we're going to kill one of them. Or it's okay to kill one civilian if we had one civilian casualties, or 10 civilians if we had 10 civilian casualties. That is simply not what proportionality is, right? Proportionality is the idea that when you launch an attack, which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, or injury to civilians, or even damage to civilian objects, or a combination, right, of those three things, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, well, then launching such an attack is prohibited. Now, you see those terms, they're at the same time very specific and very vague. It's because IHL understands that the reality, in the reality of war, military commanders on the field are obligated to take drastic decisions that are, very hard to second guess, and they do so with a set of information that they possess at the time. So let's talk about, she mentions the incident in which 42 civilians were killed in one strike. Well, this is, of course, a tragedy. I think we can all agree on that, right? It is. And when I heard the news, I was very distraught because it's such a huge figure. But the idea is that maybe 42 civilians died, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a war crime happened. Let me give you an example. If a belligerent country, a country at war, gets the opportunity, to kill the entire military leadership of of their enemy, they're having a party, like some celebratory party in a building where maybe you have 10 military officers, right, generals, but 100 civilians. Now, if you were to strike that building and kill those 10 military leaders, but kill as well 100 civilians, that wouldn't necessarily be a non-proportional attack, right? Because the military advantage you gain from such an attack is tremendous, right? You've decimated the leadership of your enemy. Now, it is done, of course, with the information that such an attack has to be done with the information that you have, and you need to make sure that you limit it at all costs, civilian casualties. But again, it's not simply the number that matters in such thing. It's the military advantage. So we need more information, right? But it seems that Israel at the time was trying to strike lines of communications and tunnels, right, that supply, as we've seen in the previous videos, rocket launching pads and mortar batteries with ammunition, and for which fighters can move. So destroying such lines of communication, it represents a real military advantage, right? So it's not necessarily a war crime when you look at the law, which is, by the way, applies to both parties in the conflict. It's customary. So that means even if Hamas isn't a member of the Geneva Conventions, it still has to obey by the rule of the international humanitarian law. And Israel, which is a member of the Geneva Conventions, but not of the additional protocol of 1977, Protocol 1, which is the one that applies in times of international armed conflict, is still customary. And Israel actually recognized its customary nature. So maybe it's not a party to the protocol. So they're trying to limit, the civilian casualties. And I'm sorry, it's very long because there's so much thing. It's no,
but it's important for us to really unpack when we say things like war crimes, and we really need to understand what that means.
Because it's so in accordance with the principle of proportionality, right? The expectation that civilians will be killed, and that civilian objectives will be hit in the framework of intentional attack against a legitimate military objective, whether it's a human or an object, such as a tunnel, right, does not make it illegal, despite those civilians or civilian objects, such as houses, parliament buildings, right? And those civilians, they still are protected from attack. You can never attack deliberately a civilian, right? This is totally prohibited under international humanitarian law. And it doesn't. So even if you have a high number of civilian casualties or wounded or killed, and a large damage to their property, it doesn't necessarily represent, prima facie a breach of international law, because if the military advantage you gain from it is greater than you assume such casualties, then it's okay. An example of something that is non-proportional would be, okay, there is Hamas. I'm sorry. Sorry for our audience. As you may hear, I'm not a native English speaker. I try my best. If you have a Hamas, foot soldier, in the middle of a building with 100 people living there, and he's a nobody, right? He just enlisted the day before. He's a foot soldier. Well, he's an enemy combatant, so you are allowed to kill him. But would you kill 100 civilians to kill, the lowest of the lowest foot soldier? I don't think so, right? And this wouldn't be a proportional attack, and this is the way it works, right? You understand? It's the military advantage you gain.
Okay. Tal, let's move on with the video then. We have a lot more to cover, and I see people in the chat are getting antsy.
For example, when Israel leveled the building housing Associated Press offices, claiming it was a secret base for Hamas, they provided no evidence whatsoever, even in secret, to the U.S. State Department.
So we just went over this point just a few minutes ago in regard to the fact that when she released this video, the IDF had already released information that this video was being used by Hamas to the U.S. to the Pentagon. However, we as the public have not received that information yet. We're currently waiting on it.
But CNN, instead of grilling Israel about the claim, instead grilled the Associated Press about turning a blind eye to Hamas. The human shield narrative is really the only defense Israel and the U.S. have.
I want to talk about this point. She tries to place corporate social media on Israel as if all of corporate media supports Israel. This is factually incorrect. This isn't how social media works. Here you're going to see on your screen 4 different reports, 5 actually different reports that I screenshotted while I was going around Twitter, and I reported on these people. On the far left, we have Yishai Fletcher, who is a right-wing, a very far right-wing activist in Israel. He reported a video regarding missile launchers that he said were used by Hamas. They weren't. They were actually from a training simulation in Israel. We see StopAntisemitism.org retweeting a photo saying that the man was giving a Hitler salute when he wasn't. He was holding up his phone. We have Al Jazeera saying that all of the individuals who were killed were from Israeli airstrikes when this was false, as we had already known that there were suspected reports of misfires by Hamas. We see Jewish Voices for Peace saying that a healthy democracy doesn't attack the free press. They're making a statement here as if Israel deliberately attacked the free press when there's absolutely no factual basis for this. All we know is the reason that the IDF claimed to attack it, and we're currently waiting on evidence. If evidence proves otherwise later on, then what they said is true. But up until now, that isn't the case. And then we have another news channel reporting that a Merkava tank was hit by a anti-tank missile. However, there's not a single report on this, and other people are reporting that this was actually just a malfunction. And so this is very, very common on social media that every side does, that they report things that are just factually incorrect. And so this has nothing to do with the specific pro-Israel narrative. This is something I hear very commonly. If I look at all the pro-Palestinian activists, they talk about the media only supporting Israel. If I look at all the pro-Israel activists, all they say is that the media supports the Palestinian narrative. essentially every single side puts the blame on the other, and they never actually look at the fact that the media is a lot more diverse than they think it is.
Maybe just a side note on that topic, because a few people, it is a commonly contested issue, like who the media actually supports. Maybe next week we'll do like a review of the media. We'll break down all the main media outlets. We'll see how they're reporting and what bias they're showing. I think that could be interesting.
Like, yeah, let's watch the video.
Yeah, I'm waiting for that.
Brutal crimes against humanity. Here's the thing. Claiming civilians you kill are human shields is not some sort of get-out-of-jail-free card. Why is it up to Israel to determine if their actions are war crimes or not? I'm going to give you 5 points that completely evaporate Israel's human shield defense and explain why it must be something to answer for in an international criminal court. Point 1. Israel provides no evidence that there are human shields. So far, the best they can do is share these photoshopped images. See, the building is red. That means Hamas is there. You know, for all of Israel's sophisticated surveillance technology with eyes over every single inch of Gaza, you'd think that they'd be able to produce more than cartoons and doctored graphics.
Well, actually, the truth is we don't even need the IDF to give us these type of sources. For one, the IDF has provided other different video clips providing the fact that Hamas has launched rockets from civilian populations. But if you don't want to believe the IDF, that's completely fine. You have no right to if you don't believe it. Let's look at France 24 while they were actually in Gaza reporting during, I think this was during the 2014 war.
While I was live on France 24 on the English network, this 80% of Gaza. Okay, you all right? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, what happened?
What happened? Fine. This was a rocket. Rockets were just shot right next to where we're standing. This is just some 50 meters away from the hotel where most of the international media is stationed. This right here is a launching pad for rockets used by Palestinian militants. Now, this type of setup is at the heart of the debate within the international community, but also between Israel and the Palestinian militants. The Israeli army has repeatedly accused Palestinian militants of shooting from within densely populated civilian areas, and that is precisely the type of setup we have right here. Rockets set up right next to buildings with a lot of residents in that right away have fled around here. Now, the other very noticeable while I was...
In fact, the only proof they have provided so far are fake videos of Hamas rockets in residential areas. On May 15th, the IDF published a video of an Israeli training operation using a Hamas decoy.
Do you guys want to comment on this, or I?
You're more than welcome to comment, but what happened, I think, is that the IDF spokesperson's unit published a video, and they were called out, for it, right, saying that this footage doesn't actually come from Gaza, right, but from inside an IDF training facility, if I'm not mistaken.
And
this is a true statement that she does make, that the IDF, for a short time, published a video that they saw online. It's important to understand that the IDF spokesperson unit isn't actually connected to a lot of the other intelligence corps of the actual army, and so they publish things based on other information. But it is still inexcusable, and this should have never been uploaded. And just as we talk about how Abby should focus on factual reporting when it comes to the conflict, so should the IDF. When the IDF reports things that are factually incorrect, such as this video, it should be called out and it should be condemned.
But claimed it was an actual Hamas missile launcher near civilians. In another lie, Netanyahu's...
This video is also true. This person did actually tweet this tweet. I actually saw it on my Twitter, and I publicly condemned him on my Twitter for this.
Spokesman tweeted a video claiming it was Hamas firing rockets next to an apartment building. Turns out this was a video from 2018 in Syria. So where's the actual evidence? If they cannot provide any, their claims must be investigated and brought to a trial. Even if there was evidence that Israel was hitting legitimate military targets, it still is illegal to kill such an outrageous amount of civilians. And you can't legally blow up a hospital, even if there are militants nearby.
You want to take this?
Yeah, so I've talked for too extensively about proportionality already, so I'll pass on that. I just repeat myself, the number of civilian casualties is not necessarily an indication of any war crime having been committed. Civilian losses and casualties in war is perhaps the grisliest aspect of war. It's also one that unfortunately is unescapable. Unfortunately, and I think we all agree here that it's a tragedy. Regarding her claims about hospitals, I find it very interesting because she says you can legally blow up an hospital. She's right. You can't just blow up any hospital. You can't attack hospitals. But there are specific sets of circumstances under which you can. I don't think it was the case during this conflict. She says you can't blow up an hospital if militants are nearby. Well, I agree. Why not target the militants, right, that are nearby? But there was an occurrence during the 2014 Gaza war where Israel struck Wafa Hospital in Gaza, and it wasn't a war crime because hospitals they benefit from a special protection, and both military and civilian hospital, by the way, under international law, under the Geneva Convention and in Protocol National Protocol 1. And this protection doesn't cease unless they are used to commit, those hospitals are used to commit, outside of their humanitarian duties, acts that are harmful to the enemy. And again, it's not just like, oh, a few people have fired, from an hospital building at my troops, so I'm going to blow it up. You need to give them, the protection ceases only after you've given them due warning, and you've given them also a reasonable time limit to stop whatever violation of IHL they were committing by using those hospitals for harmful purposes. And there's a list of conditions. If you find munition in the hospital, that doesn't lift their protection. If you have an armed guard in front of a hospital or a soldier with a weapon inside the hospital, on guard duty, it doesn't cease the operation. So I don't know if we have the footage of what I'm talking about, the strike in 2014. Tal,
I want to make one comment on international law, because if somebody is making a moral argument, right? If somebody is saying Israel should not be engaging in these airstrikes because they know civilians will be killed, and I consider that to be immoral, if that is your argument, then a defense of that, if you appeal to international law as a defense to that, that's not a good argument, because a legal argument doesn't negate a moral argument. But if somebody is coming out, and Abby said, violating international law, so I guess this is what the argument is about. Is Israel violating international law? I personally don't know much about international law. I know there's been many claims they did, and I'd say it's fair to say they have violated international law in the past. Maybe some people here can confirm or deny that, but if you want to make a moral claim, make a moral claim, and just know that a legal claim doesn't debunk that. But don't make a legal claim if you're not sure about it, because a moral claim is strong enough as is, right? So it's important to understand the difference between moral claims and legal claims. Sometimes they're intertwined, but we do see many instances when they're quite different.
I think a point before we continue on is I'm seeing in chat discussing previous events that have occurred with the IDF. I am personally not an expert in international law. I haven't studied it, and it's quite complex. But in general, I don't believe that the IDF is perfect. I believe the IDF has probably committed war crimes in the past. It probably has committed also in this recent conflict. No army is perfect, no army is going to do, and the individuals and commanders who are responsible for war crimes should be trialed for such. That's something that's important to understand. This isn't a whataboutism episode where we're trying to talk about everything that has happened in this conflict. We're talking about the fact that if we care for the Palestinian cause or the Israeli cause or any cause, we have to come from a factual basis. If Abby was appealing to us from more of a moral standpoint in terms of why war is wrong and why shouldn't we be doing this, and in any case civilian lives is tragic to lose, then fine. But if she's going to use a legal argument, then a legal argument is going to be used against her in terms of what is actually the legal argument. That's the point. As in, this video talks more from a robotic sense of her claims from a legal standpoint. From an emotional standpoint, it's horrific. I've watched the videos of kids in Gaza and what's happened, and it horrifies me every time I see it. When I see videos like this that they say a lot of things that are just factually incorrect about the situation, it doesn't help either side.
Yeah, I mean, let me just use a personal anecdote just to support what we're saying. So we've done live streams, probably 8 live streams the past 2 weeks, just because of everything going on, and I've been pretty vocal in condemnation of Israeli airstrikes. I do not think that this is the right approach to dealing with Hamas. I explained multiple times why I am against this. I didn't use the term international law once because I understood it wasn't needed in order to make a strong case. If anybody wants to see, you could look back on YouTube. We have clips of the case being made against these airstrikes. But again, you don't need to make an appeal to international law if you can't back it up. But as Tal said, and Walter, you can debate this if you disagree, but we're not saying Israel has not violated international law. They have. It's just if you're going to make a claim of it, it needs to be backed up.
Okay, so we're going to continue now and to a certain point. That's all right.
Okay. Israel should not be allowed to be above the law. Point 2. We shouldn't take Israel's claims of human shields at face value because they have an extensive history of lying about it. I think the most irrefutable example are their killings at Gaza's Great March of Return, which we documented in our film, Gaza Fights for Freedom. At this Great March, Israeli snipers directly targeted and killed 183 unarmed demonstrators, including 35 innocent children at these protests, journalists, marked press, medics performing medical aid, a man in a wheelchair, and so many more. But Israel said they were all human shields, so it was all legitimate.
Okay, so there's a lot to unravel here that we're going to get into.
Come on up!
So this, do you guys want to take over? This is something I think is more on your field.
Yeah, so maybe just to do this really concisely, the way that she handles this is, again, you can make a moral argument without making a legal argument, and it's actually a lot stronger if you make the moral argument. So, for example, when she goes so far as to say that, like, all of these people were, like, that there were, people who were wearing press uniforms and people who were performing medical duties and children died. These are factual statements. You can make an ethical argument about why, this is something that needs to be evaluated, investigated, whatever it is you want. However, there are also aspects of this where she is very consciously omitting the truth to the point where she is contradicting Hamas's own statements, right? So I actually think it's farther on in the video, Tal, if we want to go like another couple seconds through her video to get through the rest of this example.
Sure.
Here's where they really exposed themselves. According to international law, human shield applies to civilians as collateral damage when you're targeting military forces in combat. But at the Great March protests, there were no militants, nobody shooting at Israelis, nobody with weapons, no targets remotely connected to military operations. So if all of those children, medics, journalists, and disabled people were human shields, who were they shielding?
Okay, so the reason I wanted to get through that is because the following, that she lists there 4 categories of people who weren't there and then people who were there. Again, the people who were there, who she says were killed, could have been killed in an unlawful way. However, the other half of the statement that she made, that there were no combatants, no weapons, no shots fired at Israeli soldiers, this is factually incorrect. The first video that you'll see here on the top is from a border security camera. What you see here is this isn't even part of the march. This is going on in the background while the March of Return is taking place. This is an armed group of people who infiltrated from Gaza into Israeli territory. I think it's, pretty self-evident that, if someone crosses a border with a weapon, that they become, sort of a target, and that is a legitimate target under international law. So there's one example of people who are armed who are there. The second video underneath is one that was shared on Al Jazeera, and this is during the march itself. These are not necessarily members of Hamas, but people who did get through the border fence and were armed with knives in that regard. So again, this is a discussion about where does the line between protest and like legitimate right to protest versus putting yourself in unnecessary danger and creating a ambiguous situation for security forces. Where is that line? So that's the second video here from Al Jazeera. And then
الله اكبر هيا جوا يا اخوانا ادخل تعالوا الله اكبر الحمد لله يا اخوانا تم العبور شارك البريج تم العبور شارك البريج الله اكبر لله الحمد الله اكبر يا رب.
I think we get it. So this is, again, if you're going to cross an international border in the middle of a conflict zone and you're going to do so with some kind of weapon in your hand, there is a likelihood that you are going to become a target. So that's regarding one thing, but more directly to what Abby was talking about. I see people who are saying, but when are we actually debunking Abby? I think that we've been sort of doing that throughout, but like to make it very clear for people who have sort of missed it. The UN Human Rights Commission investigated this event. They concluded that there were Hamas militants who were in these protests. They confirmed that some of them were wearing civilian clothing. They confirmed that there were weapons present, and I think perhaps most importantly, Hamas themselves acknowledged that militants who belonged to their organization were killed. They put out the photos basically the day after these individuals were killed as well. So again, the children, nurses, journalists who were shot should not have been shot. However, that doesn't make the other half of what she said to substantiate that moral claim correct.
I think an important thing to understand with the chat, I see that talking about, some of them are just claims interesting. We're not saying that there weren't innocent people who were shot by IDF troops. There's probably also events where they were shot and the soldiers weren't reprimanded for such. There are also cases where they were. In any case, this video isn't trying to come from a perspective of, we're trying to prove that the IDF is so amazing and so great and this never happens. No, the IDF has committed horrific crimes and stuff has happened. But in terms of factual basis, I don't care if you're coming from a good faith argument. If you make factually incorrect statements, your argument loses all its legitimacy. She makes a really good point earlier in the video where she shows a video that was on the official IDF webpage that wasn't actually from Gaza, where the IDF was trying to prove that there was human shields, and yet they used a video that was completely fake. All that does, as she showed you, is delegitimize the point of the IDF. And so this should do the exact same thing for people who's watching this who is in support of Abby and in support of the Palestinian cause. You can't say that there was no weapons, that there was no military operations being conducted during the march when there was. You can say that there were innocent people that were killed by the IDF troops, and at the same time there were also these military operations going on. That would be a factually correct statement, but she isn't saying that, and it changes the narrative. And you can't do this if you're actually out for the truth. You can't say that one side has to constantly say the truth and one side has to bring up every little source, but my side doesn't have to bring all the sources. My side, it's okay if they lied once in a while. No, both sides should be held accountable for everything they do. You're going to actually see, I'm going to continue the video, where she brings a really, really good take against the IDF, and I'm going to discuss it for a second.
Even when they killed a celebrated female medic, Razan al-Najjar, they released a propaganda video saying she was a human shield. But shielding what? under no circumstances would kill.
This is actually a really good example of the IDF, which did use propaganda in the spokesman unit against this individual when they were trying to prove a point. There's no justification for this. I think that the soldiers who are in charge of making that video should be thrown out of their positions. I think it's not how any army should be operating, and people should be held accountable for these type of things. But it has to go both ways. This goes back to what we were talking about with someone asked in the comments, what about Palestinian war crimes, for example, committed by Hamas? I have no issue with calling out every time the Israeli Defense Force does a war crime, and the same thing should be said for Hamas. There is no one-way street in terms of how conflicts are fought. If we only go one way, then we're not really out for justice. Just as I call out every side for the false media that they present, I expect everyone to do the same. Because if you're out for the truth, then you're not trying to push a certain narrative.
Killing that many civilians at an unarmed protest with the defense that they were human shields for non-existent military targets hold up for a second in a war crimes tribunal. Today, Israel relies on the fog of war to make this claim seem possible. But just 2 years ago, Israel showed an irrefutable pattern of lying about human shields, and now they have zero credibility.
So this is, you're free to watch the rest of the video. She goes over the same points after this, but feel free to watch the entire video if you don't believe. And this goes into another discussion. I think this is where we go more into the discussion and questions. But she goes over the same points later on more to further her agenda.
I just want to add one caveat on here. I know Marvin was asking a lot of different questions, and most of these questions are sort of principled ones as opposed to technical ones. So if that's where we want to go with the conversation, then we absolutely can. I think, for example, when he says that it's a moot point and the IDF will get a pass for things that it does wrong. Walter, I think that between you and me, we can maybe offer a perspective here on how the enforcement of international law actually works. What mechanisms do countries use on their own militaries, and how the ICC works. The ICC is something I actually have pretty in-depth expertise on, like the technical aspects of it. But is it under international law? How does that work in terms of militaries investigating themselves? Is that something that is allowed for, and what are the expectations?
Yeah, so one of the key things, regarding the ICC is that the ICC, as if you look at their YouTube page, which I really do recommend because it's really interesting, you see that they're not judging every case, an instance of war crime taking place at any given time around the world. There's a reason for that, because the ICC will jurisdiction, which is not only the state parties that are party to the Rome Statute of 1998. It's not only that; it's also are you willing and capable of investigating and eventually, if indeed there is a breach of international law, putting it on trial, members of your military personnel for those war crimes, right? It's a real thing, because Israel, I think, has shown in the past, in my opinion, that it is not only capable, but it's also willing to prosecute some of its soldiers for war crimes. It's never an easy thing, right? Because it's another example. But look at some of the such investigations and trials that took place in the U.S. military, right? There was this famous case a few years ago of this Navy SEAL that was pardoned by Donald Trump. I know it has nothing to do with this video, but it's always a conflicting. It's not easy to try a soldier for war crime. We know this in Israel. I think we all remember the Elor Azaria case, right? But Israel, I think, has shown during this case, even though you may agree that for those who don't remember, it was the soldier in the occupied territories that executed some Palestinian assailant that was trying to stab another soldier, and he shot him after that after that assailant was already on the ground and defenseless and harmless. And he was tried, for not only violating the IDF rules, but also the laws of armed conflict, and he got a jail sentence. So this is not something you see every day. I'm French, as you may have heard. I don't think there was a case. France apparently targeted a wedding to kill someone in Mali a few months ago and killed 19 civilians, but it only came out 3 months after. You see, there's a level of transparency that is lacking. I'm sorry, I'm doing.
No, it's all right. It's a good answer in terms of the fact that there's precedent for how militaries have a judge advocate general and mechanisms for investigating themselves and holding their own accountable. I think that perhaps the most important caveat, I'm going to put this out here, just not dive too deep into it unless someone wants me to, is that the ICC runs on a principle of what's called complementarity, which means that it doesn't exist to supersede the rule of law or the military or military tribunals of countries. It exists as a court of last resort for countries that are unable or unwilling to carry out those investigations. So I think that one of the best case studies of this would be the open files against Omar al-Bashir, right? It wasn't very likely that he would be standing trial anytime soon within Sudan at the time that the investigation initiated by the ICC took place. Adar, there's some stuff in the chat that maybe you might want to shed some light on in terms of there's accusations that we don't spend enough time scrutinizing pro-Israel stuff. There's a thing saying that this is a disgusting attack on a journalist who reports from the ground while we sit in our armchairs. I guess fair enough.
That was weird.
We could.
I think maybe
it seems like this video did upset a fair amount of people. I'm trying to understand exactly why. I have a few theories. So if you don't know who we are or what we do, it might come off, and if you're not watching the entire thing, it might come off as we're just a bunch of people trying to defend everything Israel does, because Abby taking a very anti-Israel stance, for us to explain why she was being inaccurate or lying, it seems like in order to do that, we're defending Israel. Now, audience members who are very anti-Israel view that as us just being shills, right? And again, I'll review this back. Perhaps my analysis is wrong. But what I've noticed through doing this project here is the more biased somebody is, the more they view neutrality as bias, right? So I'm accused of being a biased mod by people on both sides. They both think that I'm pro the other side. This is just their own viewing me through their own bias. So I think that people struggle to see what we're doing, and what we're doing is breaking down where Abby was wrong or shared misinformation or lied, but they just see that as a defense of Israel, and that triggers them. So they're being triggered by that. Or another alternative is that they really like Abby Martin, and it's kind of like an attack on somebody that they like, right? People, we all humans generally have someone that they look up to and get super defensive of. We see this in politics. So anybody who holds Abby in high regard would by default be triggered by this.
I think a bigger issue also, we can't, it would be great if we could also pull up a pro-Israel video that is very biased and has a lot of factually incorrect statements, and do it exactly at the same time, yet each video takes a bit of while to actually collect all the sources and information. Just as we said, in another week or so, we're going to find a very factually incorrect famous pro-Israel video and debunk it as well. The whole point about debunking is debunking a specific video. I'm not saying that Abby doesn't have good intentions, that she doesn't care about the Palestinian cause. I'm not in her mind. It's just I want her as a Palestinian activist to say things that are factually correct. Because I think what happens is that, for example, if I was a very pro-Israel individual and I came across her video, then the second I see a statement made that's factually incorrect, I would then disregard everything else that she's saying. I want people who are either on one side or the other of the conflict, either pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian, that when they're viewing a video explaining the other side, explaining why they stand for the Palestinians or they stand for Israelis, I don't want them to immediately be, to disregard it because of a factual error that was made by accident, or they left it out because they didn't think it would match the video. That's really the point. It's not about, a certain type of analysis. I don't doubt Abby's intentions in terms of caring about the Palestinian cause. But when I was watching the video, for example, it was hard for me to listen to what she was trying to say because I kept hearing certain points that just weren't factually correct. However, I follow other Palestinian activists that were talking about the carnage and the horrific things that had happened in Gaza in the past 2 weeks. And I had no issue listening to them because I didn't see anything that was factually incorrect when they were reporting it. Any site that reports things that are factually incorrect immediately, for me, makes me not want to listen to them anymore because they're going to be pushing a certain lie, whether they're doing it on purpose or not. And us as the viewers, everyone in the chat, should really, we want the people who are, at the top, the activists, to be saying only the truth, the factual information. You can say whether something is good and bad. That's an opinion already. But when you're making factually incorrect statements, it tarnishes your objective at the end of the day.
Again, the same people in the chat, I think Bissam and another person over and over and over, I'm not seeing the evidence, I'm not seeing the evidence, I'm not seeing the evidence. Look, either go back and watch the beginning part when we find the specific things, or here I can make this a lot simpler, which is that there are perfectly legitimate ways to discuss how Israel conducts military operations within Gaza and within other military contexts and non-military contexts, where you can be critical of the practices that they're doing. The title of her video is Debunking the Idea that Hamas uses human shields, when that is something that Hamas as an organization has never even contested. There's one time when I have ever seen a Hamas official actually push back on this claim, and it was Khaled Mashal being interviewed on CNN. So this is the foreign minister, this is the foreign spokesperson of Hamas. Other than that, we have a bevy of other officials from Hamas who are acknowledging that this is a thing. And we also have Palestinians who live in Gaza who argue that this is a legitimate thing that they choose to do as well, right? That if the IAF indicates they want to bomb it, people are going to go to that building to prevent it from being bombed, which has worked in stopping bombings before, right? This is something that people acknowledge happens. So of all of the things for Abby to have sort of chosen to take on, it's very odd that this is the one. And I think that maybe a good way to sort of show, people here are very salty about, the fact that we're not being critical enough of Israel. So you want to be critical of Israel on the basis of facts and international law? Let's dive into an example. 2014, the event that was known as the Black Friday. This is something which happened in southern Gaza during a internationally brokered humanitarian ceasefire between the IDF and Hamas. An IDF unit was on patrol in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. They noticed a person spotting them. They called in for fire support from artillery or Air Force. The Air Force said, no, there's a ceasefire. We're not going to provide you with fire support. They were ambushed. 2 were killed. 1 body was taken. It wasn't sure if the individual was taken alive or dead, but it was later confirmed they were dead. This is Adar Golden, his body. And what ensued was a military protocol called the Hannibal Protocol. And the Hannibal Protocol is a very ambiguous thing that sits differently in different military commanders' heads. And the root idea of it is an Israeli idea that a soldier who has been kidnapped is more of a threat to the state than a soldier who has been killed. Why? Because the soldier who has been kidnapped can be used as a bargaining chip, and that can lead to other high-value personas being released in a prisoner exchange that would not necessarily benefit Israel, right? So there's a doctrine, there's a sort of unspoken doctrine in a lot of IDF commanders' heads that a dead soldier is preferable to one who has been kidnapped. And so in the Hannibal Protocol that they called out when Adar Golden was taken, they began basically indiscriminately firing at buildings in the area for about a 20-30 minute window to try and create a zone where it was impossible for whoever had taken him to move. Now, in that process of targeting those things indiscriminately just based on the geography, what the military commanders did was they did not take the time to do the proportionality test that I was talking about, right? They did not say this building has this military advantage and this much of civilian presence, or this, like, it's a non-military target. They didn't actually do that calculus. And they went about this process for about 20 minutes unabated, and that is something which can be classified as a war crime. That is indiscriminate. Walter, I see you want to.
Right, exactly. No, sorry, but you just said the word. It was indiscriminate fire, which is a problem because another of the principles is to operate a distinction between civilians and combatants, which are the two categories that IHL establishes of people, in armed conflict. And there was indeed a huge problem, and during that incident of Black Friday, because first of all, it's not only that Israel did not discriminate in its targets, it's also the methods and the means that were employed that were indiscriminate, because there was a lot of it was a heavy artillery but non-guided barrage, if I'm not mistaken, which is firing artillery shells. We're talking about 155 millimeter shells on a densely habited, in a densely habited area. That's indiscriminate fire. Its very definition. So yes, probably there was a war crime, but it's a heavy accusation. Like I'm saying it, hesitating, not because I'm Israeli, not because I'm, you would say I'm biased. It's because you cannot put yourself in the head of the commander at the moment he takes a decision. The commander does it with a certain amount of information, and in insight, it's very easy to condemn it. But the operational reality is very different.
So exactly. So what happened in that situation, the continuation of that, was that a more senior commander got on the radio, called for everyone to stop. And this incident, because it was so egregious and because it was so reckless and because it violated not just the principles of IHL, as is, but it violated a lot of doctrinal decisions that are made within IDF command and control centers. This was investigated by the IDF Judge Advocate General ad nauseum. It caused a real stink in Israeli society. Every right-wing person in Israel hated the IDF for months for even investigating soldiers for doing this in the first place. And yet the investigation carried on. And in the end, the individuals who made very improper decisions were, if I'm not mistaken, removed from their command. And I think some of them were actually forced out of military service as a result of this.
I think the Givati Brigade commander.
Not the commander of the whole unit, but there were commanders within the Givati Brigade who lost their commissions because of this, and more. The point being that it is totally fair play to say to someone, and again, I'm seeing lots of hate in the chat, but that's all right. We're here. If you want the conversation to take a different direction, you can suggest that different direction instead of complaining. That's one. But two is that if Abby Martin is going to accuse Israel of a war crime, then we should point to things that are actually likely war crimes. And if she is going to say that we can't trust Israel's word because of these isolated, not even isolated, but we can say, like, fine, repeated, I'll give her that, repeated instances of things that are information that is not accurate, then she cannot fall into the same trap, right? If she's a journalist and she's supposed to be informing people and she has people who rely on her for information, she needs to hold herself and her language to a higher standard. And, I think that that's all that we're really saying regarding this. And
yeah, I'll we could look at some more audience comments, try to address them. Ahmad asks, why not have Abby Martin on the conversation? At the very beginning, I sent out an invite to Abby, said we'd love to have her on. I don't know if she's going to give us the time, but if Abby would come on the show, we'd love to have her. We'd love to have a conversation with her. For those who know our program, really, the door is wide open to everybody. If somebody is in contact with Abby Martin, feel free to connect us. I'd love to speak to her. So I see somebody keeps mentioning the title, and the title is bias. Well, what's the title again? Debunking Abby Martin's Israel-Palestine Misinformation. Well, it's I mean, that's exactly the intention of the video, to debunk Abby Martin's Israel-Palestine misinformation. So I don't know. It's not that it's biased as much as it's honest. That this is exactly what this video is about. It's about debunking Abby Martin's Israel-Palestine misinformation. Real quick, I just want to show some thought behind how we title things. So, you want to choose a title that is that will hit certain keywords and will get people clicking, right? We don't get too heavy into clickbait. We don't like that, but we do play into it a little bit. So Abby Martin just released a video that uses the word debunking. And you could imagine that a lot of people who are going to look for Abby Martin's video are going to type in debunking, and then they're going to type Israel or debunking Palestine, right? So a lot of people who search for Abby Martin's video are then going to find our video. So it's actually quite a clever title that I actually have no shame in. But
I think I think a reason why a lot of people have an issue with the title is it comes from the usual conversations. Usually when a different channel, either pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian activists, are making a video about debunking a different video, it's usually with an agenda of trying to make them look bad and making my side look better. And that's usually the point of debunking. You'll never see a lot of channels for example, just thinking of the BDS movement and Stand With Us. Both of them are very much on the different planes of pro-Israel and pro-Palestine. You'll never see Stand With Us making a debunking video against the Israeli government. You'll never see a BDS movement making a debunking a pro-Palestinian channel or debunking Hamas claims. Their objective is very, very clear. They want to make themselves look good, and they're not going to ever look at themselves. The whole point at Sulha is we don't care who you support. The point is we want you to be factual in your claims. We're not going after the Palestinian cause or the movement or what has happened in Gaza. We're going after factual claims that people make, just like we're going to next week go after a pro-Israel video that we've seen that people are talking about, and we want to talk about the factually incorrect statements made in those videos. The point is for us to have the basis of facts. And if any of you guys have videos to share that you think that we should show, then great. I'm not against going after any channel or any individual. I think that any individual who reports something that's factually incorrect should be called out for it, and they should change it. This video, hopefully, if it were to reach Abby and she did see it and she understood that our intentions aren't against her as an individual, is I would like to see in her future videos when she talks about Israel or she talks about the occupation of Palestinians or stuff like that, that she has sources for all of her claims, and that she doesn't make wild accusations. For example, a lot of the things that you said were assumptions based on different things, but she brought it to the audience as fact. Something that, if you've seen me on this channel before, is every time before I speak, I say, in my opinion. And when I'm stating a factual claim, I'm just going to state it as fact. And that's in the future when I watch Abby, I hope that she's going to have sources in all of her videos, and that she differentiates between her personal opinion and how she views the conflict and factual statements. It's about helping people talk about the conflict in a more factual manner and not spreading lies.
I would like to say something. I'm going to make a confidence because we've mentioned, I really hope that Abby Martin watches this video of the debunking video of her debunking video. I'm not trying to defend Israel or the actions of the spokespersons of Israel here. Absolutely not. But I think that when she says that the IDF lies, by showing a video by trunking a video of, for example, the Palestinian nurse that was field medic that was shot, in the March of Return protest, or even during this latest round of fighting with the rockets, claiming it's from Gaza when it's from a training center in Israel. There's this thing called Enlon's razors. I don't know if you've heard the term, but it goes like that. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. I think that it's something that in the realm of Israeli-Palestinian media coverage or activist coverage or partisan coverage is something that we forget. I can tell you firsthand, full confidence, I've served in I'm an Israeli, so I was obligated to serve in the army, and I served in the spokesperson's unit. I think people have a wrong idea of what the IDF is like abroad. It's not like a machine that functions like perfectly well. It's a lot of 18 years old who are a bit lost, do not necessarily have the highest, the best training prior to going to the IDF, and they're plunged in, there's the operational reality. I think that the IDF spokespersons unit, when they made those videos, they acted non-professionally. I think there was a failure on the part of the commanders, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily come out of malice. They're not trying to lie, because they know that if they get caught lying, it's going to be terrible for them. They're going to lose their credibility. She says, "Oh, they have lost their credibility," and that's their worst nightmare. So I think it's something important we need to say.
Can maybe Adar, do you want to direct some other questions from the chat, because I'm seeing a lot of commentary on our commentary, and I think it could potentially be
sure. Yeah, we could definitely keep the chat going. We love this. So First thing, I saw the Mossad asked a few times why no one ever talks about Palestinian war crimes. I haven't put much thought into it. Those who know me know I don't talk about international law. It's not much of an interest to me. I'm not saying there's no importance to international law, but normally I ground my arguments in what I view to be moral and effective if you're looking in terms of approaches to activism, right? They need to be ethical and effective. That's my framework for how I live life and how I look at the conflict. It's possible that the reason that you hear less about Palestinian war crimes could just be pure bias. It could be that because Palestinians are weak and Israel is strong, that they're held less accountable than Israel. It's possible that how international law is applied doesn't apply to them the way it applies to us, right? I'm not sure to be the case. For me, I can't answer your question that well because I'm less interested in that. When Israel does something wrong, I say it. When Palestine does something wrong, I say it. It's, for me, that's how I look at it. And I don't really care much about what the international community or other people say. That's not what drives. That's not really what drives how I approach things. Maybe somebody else here has a different take on this, but let the world be one-sided or biased. So what? We know what our mission is. We know what we're doing.
I would just say to the Mossad, you're factually incorrect. It's covered in international media all the time. And also, if you want a really good perspective on this, when Palestine joined the ICC, when they acceded to the Rome Statute, that means that they also made themselves available to investigation by the ICC. If you go into their website and you read some of the preliminary reports that were drafted up under the Office of Bensouda, the original prosecutor who was looking into this matter, then you will see a discussion of the possibility of war crimes on both sides, detailed pretty evidently. So it might seem like that due to filter bubbles, or it might seem like that due to online silos, but I'm telling you from a factual basis, it's not an accurate assessment.
Cool.
Sorry, I would like to answer the Mossad's comment. I think that there's also I don't want to say cultural factor in it, but something in the perception of, Israel is a country that has been established more than 70 years ago with a functioning administration, a country that one of its main, I would say, claim when it talks, to the media is that we're the only democracy in the Middle East. So perhaps somehow the message has worked and Israel is held to a higher standard. This is actually one of the biggest criticism of the ICC, is that they say you only ever try people from African countries or like the Balkans, because they had the residual cases from the special tribunal. So you only target the weak, and it's true. it doesn't look. I think there's a cultural thing in the perception, at least, that we're not talking about Palestinian war crimes, because there are certainly, Hamas and Islamic Jihad are certainly committing war crimes, without a question.
So this is an interesting point that Aaron brings up. Aaron says, why can't you correct her and point out faults, then say, but yes, she's pretty much right. So I guess what Aaron's saying, she says the general concept of what Abby is getting at is correct. She may have used misinformation and lies to make the point, but again, the general message is correct, and we're just being nitpicky. Now, I want to give that idea. I want to bring that up as potentially possible, right? What is Abby's general? What is she getting at? And is there truth to what she's getting at? And she just decided to take a path that was disingenuous. So what's the general theme of her argument? That Israel justifies killing civilians because they say they're being used as human shields, which there's no proof of. So that's essentially it, right? Israel justifies killing civilians by saying they're human shields, but there's no proof of Hamas using human shields. That's her message, right? So I would say it's interesting because I don't hear the human shields argument be used to justify as much as I just hear collateral damage, right? The justification I hear Israel generally make is we try to minimize civilian harm, but civilians are killed because Hamas shoots from densely populated areas. So I guess that's the human shield claims, right? So because we're responding to Hamas targets in highly populated areas, then civilians are being killed. That's not some novel claim that militaries make, right? So every single military engagement has some kind of civilian casualty as collateral damage. This doesn't need to act as a justification, but Israel making a human shields claim is not novel in any way, shape, or form. At the end of the day, if we look at, like, in terms of numbers, Israel dropped over 1,000 bombs on Gaza in this round, right? Over 1,000. And how many civilians did we say had been killed? Around 100. So, right? Are those numbers?
Well, even if we want to say that every single, like, let's assume for a moment that absolutely zero of the people who were killed were combatants, then we're talking about, I think we said 239. 239.
Look up the Ministry of Health in Gaza. So.
But the point being that it's a 25% death to munitions rate is what you're getting at, Adar.
Right. So for every 4 bombs dropped, 1 civilian is killed. Now, one person is killed. Okay, one person could be a combatant, could be a civilian.
It said 243.
Again, around 25%. So Israel drops 4 bombs and kills 1 person, either civilian or combatant. Anybody who, is claiming that we're intentionally targeting civilians, that doesn't seem to be grounded in, just in the numbers, right? Can the case still be made? Yeah, you can make that case. It just doesn't seem to be likely given these numbers. Now, so again, is what Abby is saying is right? I don't know. It just seems like an interesting way to make a point. What I would say, and this would be my advice to Abby or anybody who wants to condemn Israel. Israel has the power. Israel's done very little to change the status quo the past 10 plus years. The status quo will continuously create these situations of violence, whether it's another intifada, whether it's terrorist attacks, whether it's rocket fire. Palestinians are not going to accept this as the reality. Violence will be a result of the status quo. Israel's response will always harm more Palestinians than what Palestinians can harm of Israelis. Israel bears the responsibility to change the status quo, and it's unjustifiable to do nothing about it. Right? That's a strong claim. nothing I said there can be debunked. You could disagree, right? You could say, well, it's not all Israel's responsibility. Hamas bears responsibility, right? There's a narrative war. You don't need to agree with what was said, but that's a very strong claim you can make to critique Israel. And it's just, I'm not presenting things as facts that just aren't, right? So again, Aaron, to answer your question, she's trying to say that Israel is justifying the civilian casualties by a human shields argument. In a sense, yes, which is in no way novel. It's what every single military does. So again, it's just not a strong argument. Like, that is the norm of how militaries engage. There's a military engagement, civilians died, it wasn't intentional, we continue. So again, I think it's a bad argument. She made a bad argument and supported it with wrong information. So, I don't know how much credit she deserves on this one.
Maybe just to add on to that, Adar, we didn't actually get to it in the video, but later on in the video, she makes another claim, which I found particularly puzzling, and it also, for me, reckoned back to another source, which is that later on in the video, when arguing about Israel civilian, human shields, there's no evidence to support Israel's claims. And by the way, there are Israeli soldiers embedded amongst, you see soldiers everywhere in Israel, i.e., Israel is embedding its soldiers as well. I think that people would recognize that that's a bit disingenuous as well, right? This isn't an idea that she had originally. I don't know if she's drawing it from this place, but the parallel is a little striking. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the co-founder of Al-Qaeda, rationalized that there is no such thing as an illegitimate target, as a civilian target in Israeli society because of the draft, because there's a conscripted service, right? And therefore, everything is fair game. There is no such thing as targeting people who are innocent because the entire country is complacent, in theory, right? So if that's an argument that she was going to make, I would prefer that she make it flat out instead of trying to create a false equivalency when it's known that a false equivalency is there. And what I mean by that is that when she says that Israel is embedding its military among its civilians, look, I've been there when Hamas has fired rockets on a military base. They know exactly where they are. The map hasn't changed for the past 30 years. Like, these bases are pretty immovable, right? And when they choose to target bases, so let's say Hatzerim Air Force Base, which is near Beersheba, probably the main Air Force base that's managing the front of the operations against Gaza, if Hamas were channeling all of their rocket fire in that direction to keep planes from taking off and to try and strike Israeli military targets, it would be a very different conversation that we'd be having, and that would be a completely legitimate completely legitimate move under war. And I think that no Israeli soldiers or civilians would be shocked or appalled at the fact that soldiers are dying in war, because that's what they're there to do, right? So again, if I had to offer advice to Hamas in this video, I would say, you have the ability to choose your targets wisely, and you should. But she's creating a situation here where even if the underlying premise of what she's saying is true and you agree with the principle, then it's impossible to believe the rest of it because it's on such shaky ground. And I keep seeing the same question come up from different people, which is, are you saying targeting civilians is fair game? Again, if you're coming in late to the video, no, there's a thing called proportionality, which means that civilians can't, there's a known thing that in war, civilians might die. What you do is you mitigate that as much as possible, and they cannot be the target. What you have to ask yourself is the direct military advantage that you get from this more than the damage that you would do to civilians. So civilians can die, probably will die in war, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a war crime, but that doesn't mean it's okay either. Just making that clear.
Yeah, I want to add something else because she does say that later, and she also adds a comparison with, Hamas militants, at night in their beds being targeted, right, when they're at home and there's a family. This is a good question. And she kind of hints it when she talks about the March of Return. It's this idea that, you're a Hamas militant, so when you're at home, it's like not fair game to target you, right? And so there's this thing, like we talked about distinction, like you're a civilian, you're a combatant, you're a member of an organized armed force, whether official military or guerrilla group, whatever. Hamas is not an official military; it's a guerrilla group. Not calling it terrorist because that's not how international works. It's a guerrilla group, and well, let's say you can have another profession. You can be a photographer and be a member of Hamas, and so you go and take photographs. I don't know, of weddings at night, and during the day you take part in firearm trainings or maybe even launching a few rockets. There's this idea in international that's called a revolving door policy. I think it's a very good image. It's that, well, it's not like, oh, today at this time of your schedule, you're a Hamas guy, so I can kill you. But once they don't, most of the time, we don't even wear uniforms. But once you're like out of this time schedule when you're the Hamas guy, you become the photographer. I can't target you because you're a civilian and civilians cannot be targeted. Well, the idea is that if you take often, part in activities of armed groups, you become all the time targetable, right? So, a Hamas militant. So, just to come back to the March of Return, the 50 Hamas militant, or that Hamas claims that 50 of their people died in the March of Return. They're not innocent civilians being killed, because the laws of armed conflict apply. They're legitimate targets. So it's just an interesting, plus on that.
Well, I think a good way to sort of illustrate that again is like, right, if someone were to try and assassinate an IDF officer even when they were off duty, right, would that still be considered a legitimate target?
There's this image that you can go kill, a cook who's a military cook in his slip, in his vacation house, by the swimming pool, anytime, even if he's not wearing uniform, is targetable. That's how it works. In Israel, you said it. It's a conscription army, so it's not a professional army. So from the moment you get your military paper until the moment you receive your letter of discharge, even the second before, you are completely targetable. If Hamas is to send a rocket, which was what you seem to be calling for, Ari, it's just like...
I'm not saying shoot rockets in military bases. I'm saying if you have to shoot rockets, please...
Exactly, that's where you should send them. I agree.
I could actually understand why Hamas wants to target civilian. It's like their capability to hit military targets is very low. They want to create terror. Terror is the tool of the weak, generally speaking. If they had an ability to fight our military, then maybe they would. We could say that that's a war crime. We could say that it's indefensible, but for them, it's about making life of Israelis difficult. So we give up some concessions, or perhaps so they get more support from other Gazans or Palestinians in the West Bank or the international community. Maybe they shoot rockets at civilians because they want us to respond, and then they'll get funded, right? So, like, if you want to look at it strategically, it makes sense for Hamas to shoot rockets at civilians. If we want to make, again, a moral argument, that's slightly different territory, but...
And now I kind of want to push back on that, Adar.
Yeah, sure.
Because there are, I'm not going to list them, here on this program because I've already given Hamas enough advice that I don't need to give them intel as well, right? But like, there are enough military installations in the immediate vicinity of Gaza that they can hit with a whole variety of the things in their arsenal. And by the way, the idea that the rockets that they have aren't targetable at all, it's that there's a reason that Israel, assassinated a guy who was in charge of their rocket targeting program. Like, they've improved a lot in their technology, and it's not like they can pick out what building they want to hit, but they can definitely pick out which, square half kilometer they want the rocket to land in, and barring, technical malfunctions and high winds at high altitude that they wouldn't be able to account for, they will. So I think that there's enough military bases immediately around the area of Gaza that if they wanted to maintain a steady, constant barrage on these bases, make it impossible for soldiers to come in and out to do their basic duties, to fulfill, like, literally make it technically and tactically impossible for the siege of Gaza from a military perspective to continue, there is a way for them to do that. And I think that what you pointed out is that you pointed out the strategic element of it. And this is something why you have academics who are working on things like a universal definition of terrorism. One of the definitions that we heard that was a working definition in my undergraduate was that there's a very clear distinction between terrorism and guerrilla warfare, right? If Hamas is targeting if Hamas is targeting Israeli political leaders, that's guerrilla warfare, not terrorism, right? Because these are people who are directly involved in the conflict, right? If you're targeting civilians, that's terrorism. And by the way, the terrorism without a value judgment on the word, right? I'm not even saying that, like, the whole argument about one man's terrorist and another man's freedom fighter. I don't really care about that. Terrorism just being technically defined in raw terms as targeting civilian populations in order to create pressure to achieve political goals, right? Like, plain and simple, whoever does it, whether we're talking about Tamil Tigers, whether we're talking about IRA, whether we're talking about Jewish organizations around the 1940s in the British Mandate. Like, again, this is a technical working definition. It doesn't have anything to do with a value judgment on it. But what you're saying, Adar, is it falls into that second category of targeting civilians to create that political pressure. And the question is, again, is that moral? There's a legal question to it as well. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah. So thanks, Art. To the Hamas members watching this, here's some info. Do what you will with that.
I guess I just accidentally committed treason. Damn it! But
Okay. This
I don't know you.
I like this question. When Gazans look at the situation today, do you think that the majority would change their mind about their votes in previous elections, or would they have no regrets? So Gazans voted in 2007? Was when 2006 they had democratic elections and they voted for Hamas, and that's essentially when the siege of Gaza began, because Hamas is a terror organization that doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist. Whether a preemptive siege is justified, up for debate, but that's how the siege of Gaza came to be, and Hamas got democratically elected. I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but I think it's something like 60% of Gazans are under the age of 18, right? And if we look at the percent of Gazans, maybe someone can fact check this. If you go back to 2006 when the elections happened, that was 15 years ago. So what percentage of Gazans are under the age of 33? I don't know the exact number, but the majority of Gazans didn't vote, never voted for Hamas, never had a say in who their government is, right? So it's important to keep that in mind. That being said, do they regret collectively their decision to vote for Hamas? I'm not sure, but what I do know is that these engagements we have with Hamas increase their popularity amongst Gazans. Gazans are not crazy about Hamas. They don't support them how Hamas takes care of them. They recognize that they use their funds on militarism and not on social causes, right? There is a recognition here. And the people of Gaza fear Hamas. Hamas is a brutal, authoritarian regime. But they also view Hamas as the protectors against the greater enemy, and that's Israel. So this is why one of the reasons I'm very critical of how Israel engages with Hamas, because not only does it kill civilians, but it also makes Hamas more popular, and it solidifies the teachings Hamas give their people about Israel. Right? Hamas will teach their citizens that we're evil, and then the only thing they ever hear from us are our bombs. Right? So we reinforce an education that they already get. This strengthens Hamas, and it makes the population that we need to find a way to make peace with turn more against us. So that's kind of how I look at it. Do they regret it? I don't know if that's how they look at it, but they view Hamas as their protectors against us.
I think also in general, I mean, I've watched a few interviews with Gazans who are talking about Israel and Hamas and what do they think about the leadership, is that it doesn't really matter how you view Hamas as a terror organization or as a resistance force. For most Gazans, at the end of the day, whether or not Hamas fires a few rockets at Israel or dozens of rockets, for them, all they see is the destruction that comes to them when there are Israeli airstrikes. And when you have a 1-ton bomb falling on someone's house, there's going to be a lot of collateral damage. And for the families and the children and the people that are killed, due to this collateral, they don't care about the rules of law, and they don't care if it's justified by the ICC and other courts. All they know is they've lost their kids, they've lost their family members. I saw this report about a guy who had, I think it was a bookstore, and he lost it in this recent conflict, and that was his whole life. And for a lot of these individuals, it doesn't matter if in the larger picture and the way that we see things, Hamas is responsible for that. If that's true, they see Israel as responsible for that. It doesn't matter if Israel is justified in that bombing because there was a militant in a house adjacent and he just was the collateral. For him, his livelihood, his passion, everything that he had is gone because of the Israeli airstrike. And so he is most likely going to turn to violent means in order to hit back at Israel. And every time we have these conflicts since 2006, every time Hamas has fired rockets, every time Israel has had an airstrike on Gaza, we don't get anywhere in the bigger picture of things, because when we attack Gaza, justified or not, it doesn't really matter. Many Gazans lose their lives, and others have trauma and are terrified. And in Israel, you have many people on the southern borders of Gaza have PTSD. I remember when I was running to the bomb shelters in these past 2 weeks, I remember meeting people and they were talking about how much they hate Arabs and hate Palestinians because, they see these rockets heading towards them and they think, oh, why do they want to kill me? They don't really understand Hamas and why are they doing this and what is the greater complication? They don't care if it's justified by Hamas. All they care about is the fact that rockets are landing on their houses and that rockets are getting blown up in the sky. Each side, they don't care about the larger political landscape or the international courts or laws or all that fun stuff. All they care about is the fact that they're losing their lives and having PTSD. And in the long term, this doesn't help. We just keep having these conflicts since 2006 with Gaza. And as you said, our government, the Israeli government at the moment, this is my personal opinion, I don't think that they do anything really to actually resolve the situation long term. All we do is try to, we'll strike Hamas as powerful as Israel can until they can't hurt us for the next 5 years, and then we wait another 5 years for them to do it again. But we don't try to resolve the situation, because every year that Israel and Hamas are at each other's throats, more and more Israelis and way more Gazans are losing their lives.
So I just want to be, I don't want to be the devil's advocate here, but first of all, I agree with what you said. I agree with what you say, but so regarding, we're still answering that question, is do they regret, having voted for Hamas, or do they, it's not like they voted in 2006 with the hope that Hamas would be such a fantastic, game-changing, player. It's not like Hamas suddenly appeared out of the blue. I mean, we all know in the region, I say the region, I mean the Palestinian territories and Israel, what Hamas is about. During the 90s, there was a heavy campaign of bombings by Hamas. So it was attributed, to prevent the Oslo agreements from ever taking place. Then you had the second Intifada, and on parallel with the second Intifada, which involved shooting attacks, suicide bombings, and bombings on buses and restaurants, you also have rockets being fired from 2001 from the Gaza Strip while it was still occupied by Israel, towards Sderot, towards the Sderot, which is a town that is at its closest point less than 900 meters from the Gaza border, and the other kibbutzim and localities around Gaza. So it's not like it can come as a total surprise. I cannot believe that. You've seen what they're about. They're shooting rockets. Do they regret? I mean, we can't tell, right? We're not there. But I want to make I think it's perhaps an interesting. If you look at, I would invite the person who asked that question to look. Listen again. It's a terrible. it sounds like a terrible comparison. I'm not claiming that Hamas is equivalent to Nazi Germany or the Nazi Germany is like Hamas. None of that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, the Germans, they elected in 1933 the Nazi party, and then it led them to a terrible war, and their cities were destroyed, their country occupied. So if you ask them, do they regret voting for that? I guess yes. That's my best guess. You've lost everything. So, but again, during war, like you said, we tend to rally around the flag, and you become more extreme. You've got people who you'd never think say, you'd never imagine hearing them, saying, I hate Arabs, and being openly racist. They do say it because there's a lot of frustration. Don't you want to die? I would say that probably gays, the people from Gaza, they regret, Hamas once the fighting is done. I don't think that they regret it during the fighting.
Interesting differences in perspective there. Okay, this is a nice comment. Jason Richards goes, Adar, you're really a sad person. I don't know, I consider myself to be pretty happy most of the time. But, I hear you. Pure propaganda on your end, he continues. So it's actually funny. Jason, are you pro-Israel, pro-Palestine? Like, which part of this triggered you?
Can I offer a perspective on this? Because it's not going to dogpile on him specifically. There's a couple of people who are like,
yeah, I just want to ask Jason to share what he thinks is propaganda, so we could actually address the claim, because I don't know what side he's coming from or what triggered him. So Jason, explain yourself. We'll address it. No problem.
Also, ET, if ET can, like, you're giving a lot of comments, and I'd like a question. I'd like to engage a little bit more.
Yeah, I was going to say, ET, I could tell that you're upset about this. We're happy to engage with you. Share with us what's upsetting you, where you feel one of us went wrong, maybe all of us went wrong. Let's talk about it.
More about like specifying a question or something that you'd like to actually us to be open about what we believe.
Jason continues, any objectivity in this stream. So I would really need to go out and say this, like, every individual has bias, right? We all have bias. I think everyone here makes an effort. Everyone here on this panel right now makes an effort to present things in as fair a way as possible. When we share our opinions, we say that. Again, we're not perfect. There's obviously room for improvement, but to somehow see this and think that there's zero attempt whatsoever to be fair, I mean, you got to be living in a different universe. Like, no offense, bro, but that's like, come on.
I literally gave technical advice. Like, how much more balance do you need?
Let's act in good faith here. Come on.
I'm trying.
Like, the Mossad asks me if I'm engaging in leftist self-blame. So I don't know what this is referring to. I think that's a claim. My critique of Israel, you view as me engaging in leftist self-blame. I don't know if this has to do with anything relating to the left-right paradigm. Generally, my approach to life is all about personal responsibility. When I have an issue with somebody on an interpersonal level, they might be 90% at fault, but I could acknowledge that they're at fault. I can't change them. I could only change myself. So I reflect and see how I can be better in the future and not get into situations like that. That's on an interpersonal level. On a state level, I view the same thing with the nation I'm a part of. I hold my country accountable. I try to make my nation better. Is it possible that there's a lot of blame that should go to the other side? Sure, but I don't live on the other side. I don't vote for the government of the other side. I generally look to improve my own people. So when I give harsh critiques of Israel, that's essentially what being a patriot is, in my opinion. That's just how I choose to live my life. That's not a leftist, rightist thing. If anything, personal responsibility, I'd say the right's a little bigger on like that value. Maybe not when it comes to engaging with your enemy, but at least on an interpersonal level, they're good on that. So,
I see a question that I want, because I think it's a very general statement that I think needs some nuance. Where is it about that Jason made?
Let's see. How can an occupier be a victim?
No, it's before that.
Oh, actually, I love this question. I want to. How can an occupier be a victim? How can Palestinians defend themselves? So people often say this, but it kind of takes a little context out. So Israel has the power. Israel's the occupier, right? We control the West Bank. Walter doesn't agree, but I'm going to frame it in a way
I thought we were talking about Gaza. Then you said West Bank. So.
Yeah. We're not occupying the West Bank, but it is under siege, right? You know, we do control what goes in and out, and we occupy the West Bank with our military. Sure. When Hamas targets a city and civilians are killed, the mother who just lost her child is not any less a victim because she lives in a country that is powerful, right? So we could acknowledge power dynamics, but that doesn't take away the understanding that individuals on both sides in a conflict are victims, right? So it's important to keep this in mind. And just because Hamas is weak, just because the Palestinians are weak, that doesn't mean that by default everything they do is justified, right? Some would say Palestinians, given their conditions, can do whatever they want, and they're not responsible for their actions because they're being oppressed. That is a position. I personally think that accountability is a very strong societal force that helps people make better decisions in the future, right? So whether you are privileged or not privileged, oppressed, or on the side of the oppressor, we need to have empathy towards victims. And we also need to hold people accountable. If Hamas were to be held accountable for certain actions, they might act in a way that may gain them more legitimacy in the eyes of the international community and in Israel's eyes, right? So there's a case to be made for accountability for people across the board, and there's an even stronger case to be made for empathy for the individuals who are involved in a conflict. Rest of the panel could push back or.
Well, I would just say that, you know, this is something I mentioned last time I was on your show, Adar. Everyone who hasn't gotten a chance to see it, go online, Google Daniel Bartal, Ethos of Conflict. There's a website called beyondintractability.com. Just give it a read. It's if you want to talk about the understanding of victimization and everything, just go there.
I want to just answer to what you said about, you know, the oppressor, oppressed, and the duality, because listen, I think, and you said that many times, and I agree with you. There is total legitimacy to the Palestinian claims. Not only that, I think that you know, I might not agree with all of it. I'm not even saying half of it, but the Palestinian cause is a just cause. You know, like if we want to have you know, political self-determination of a state, it's a just cause. And as you know, Jews, we aspire to the same thing, right, as Israelis. So that's perfectly understandable. But again, I don't think it's because, you know, this duality, oppressor, oppressed, it's a judgment of valor. Because I'll just give an example. Again, I'm sorry, I'm playing a bit the devil's advocate here. But
Play it.
The neo-Nazis in Germany, you know, are technically, you know, they're oppressed because according to German law, you know, you can't have a neo-Nazi party or symbols or activities. You know, those are illegal. So they are technically oppressed. Are they right because they're oppressed, or is it a just cause because they're oppressed? What about, you know, any religion, right? I won't say the Islamic terrorists, but we've got our own Jewish terrorists in Israel. We know that only too well. Well, you've got laws against, you know, such people who want to use violence to political ends. Are they there? So they're technically oppressed. Are they right because they're oppressed? I don't think it's a way of correctly examining the situation. You know, I'm always a bit reticent to use that. you can be strong and still have right, be just, and being weak doesn't necessarily mean that you're always right,
It's funny. I was about to click on that question as well. I wanted to talk
That
about
one, what Aaron
I
said.
think it's a really good thing to talk about. So Aaron asked, if
Sure.
Hamas dropped off the face of the earth, the issues and then the oppression is still going to be there. Well, that is true. That's the thing. I think that Hamas makes it a lot harder for Israelis who are looking to find more peace. Again, I see a lot of people talking about what was 70 years ago and the complexities of what happened back then. None of us were alive back then. None of us here are responsible for what happened back then. I can't change the past, and I promise you that if I lived 100 years ago, I probably would have done things differently in terms of what happened with the establishment of the state of Israel. But I can't go back, and I have to deal with what we have here today. I think when we talk about Hamas, I think what it essentially does is every time it fires missile rockets at Israel, justified or not, Israelis get more and more fearful of Palestinians as a whole. They bunch Palestinians, all of them, into whatever Hamas is. And instead of us blaming Hamas and that leadership for putting more and more fear into Israelis, which inevitably is going to force Israelis to want to put more security measures and evidently put more military occupation against the Palestinians every time these things happen. I think that without Hamas, this might be a little bit easier simply because we wouldn't have this constant rock in Israel, and maybe the different peace groups that are in Israel that are fighting against the current administration and that are fighting for Palestinians to have more rights and for Palestinians to not be under the military security controls that they're currently under at the moment. It's a long battle, and I think it's important to note that there are a lot of organizations in Israel and there are a lot of people in Israel that are trying to fight for a better future for Palestinians in this country and trying their hardest. I don't have Netanyahu's number. I can't call him up and tell him what to do. I can't lift every checkpoint. I can't lift every security barrier. It's not in my power, and I don't understand the complexities of why all of them exist exactly. It's not as easy as you think it is. But none of the people in this call, and most of the people, I would say, who are in the Sulha group, are people who want the current status quo to keep on, as in we want to change the situation. We want to make it better for everyone living here. If I didn't, then I wouldn't be speaking with the other side and people who are on the different side of the political spectrum than I am. We're trying. It's slow, but I don't think that you should expect one side to be able to do everything. I'm not the Israeli government, and I can't tell the Israeli government what to do. I fight against it. I personally do it through media analysis, but everyone does it a different way.
Yeah. Also, I think something that many people don't quite give much consideration, they view Israel as the powerful one, so the onus is on them to bring about change. And I hear that, and I agree to a large extent. What people seem to not understand, and it's probably because they don't really care much, but what steps can Israel take to actually achieve peace? Most people cannot outline the A to Z process on how to do that.
Well,
right?
There are people who, again, like extremes on both sides. There are people who suggest that you can do that unilaterally is the other side ceasing to exist, right? And that's obviously the untenable solution. That's the only tangible solution that's been floated so far, and it's the most untenable.
Exactly. So many would say just end the occupation, right? So what does it mean to end the occupation? People have different understandings of that. But let's say it means removing all the settlers from the West Bank, risking a civil war. Let's say we do it, we pull them all out. We retreat to 67 borders. We end the siege on Gaza. Does that solve the conflict? I'm not convinced it does in any way, shape, or form. The aspiration to free Palestine from the river to the sea is not unpopular amongst Palestinian society. It's Hamas's official position. So to think that it's just as simple as withdrawing and everything will be fine, that's not really grounded in reality.
Well, we tried in 2005 in Gaza.
Correct, and Hamas came to power. So Israelis and Israel as a nation is very skeptical about pulling out of the West Bank and leaving the West Bank to just see what happens and hope for the best. It seems like it very well may be an existential threat to Israel. So let's say we acknowledge that most Palestinians are not happy with the two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. They really want to be able to go to lands where their parents and grandparents lived, right? Akko, Haifa, Yafo. As Jews, we should understand that. We returned after thousands of years. But so let's say we have a one binational state. Everyone can come. Israelis and Palestinians, it's all free. Are Jews guaranteed to be safe? That's not likely. Not given the 100 years of conflict. Not given that there are a significant amount of the population that aren't shy in their aspirations to remove Jews from the land. So again, I agree, the onus is on Israel. But to make it seem like it's just so easy and Israel can just do A, B, C, and then you have peace, well, what is that A, B, C? No one really knows. And the people who are loudest in their claims that saying it's all on Israel don't give any real viable solution that ensures that Jews remain safe. So they expect that the Jews living here put themselves in severe danger just in order for Palestinians to be liberated, right? So they're valuing Palestinian life over Jewish life. Jews just happen to value their lives over others, right? Pretty natural. If you want your claim to actually have weight and have people listen to it, make the claim that the onus is on Israel, but try to give an actual process for how we do that without Israel ceasing to exist. And if your position is that Israel should cease to exist, well, then I'd say you're probably not so relevant to the conversation because Israelis generally won't take you seriously. That'll just be used as fodder as to why we can't make any concessions because people are trying to destroy Israel, and it just aids in the radicalization of the Israeli people, right? So ground what you're saying in reality. Understand the complexity of it. Just being a keyboard warrior that's saying it's all on Israel and the occupation, cool, bro. But that doesn't do anything.
I think in general, in terms of, I think I'll give a small example. One, it's first to understand that no one, as I said earlier, none of us here were alive 100 years ago. None of us are responsible for what happened 100 years ago, whatever your claims are. So that's irrelevant in my eyes. We all live here currently, so we're trying to fix the current situation. Let's say when Israel put more security measures in place, it lowered the amount of attacks by Palestinians, justified or not, on Israeli civilians. If I were to now lift those security measures, which they do cause harm to the Palestinians, it's lack of movement, it dehumanizes people who have to go through it every single day. But the general gist of it being in place is for different security measures. And it has the other effect of hurting people's daily lives. Now, if I want to remove those checkpoints, that's my honest opinion. But the question is, how do we do that? Because if I were to tomorrow morning call up Netanyahu, because obviously I have that power, according to some people, and just tell him to remove the checkpoints, just completely remove all the checkpoints, and should I take the responsibility of Palestinians who are very mad and then go out and kill civilians and kill Jews and kill anyone who is Israeli? Do I want to be responsible for that? For all these innocent people that get killed because we lift their restrictions? Why the majority of Palestinians would be thankful and would be rejoicing to not have these restrictions on them, there would be the individuals who would use this great opportunity to bring suicide bombers, to bring stabbings, to bring guns, and try to kill as many civilians as possible. If you individually, as a person, want to be responsible for every death that occurs because of this, fine, that's on you. But me living here with my family and my people and the people surrounding me and my loved ones, I'm not willing to do that and take that thing. And so I personally try to go the route of first trying to rehumanize people, that I want Palestinians to understand that not every Israeli is responsible for the horrific things that our government can do, and that not every Palestinian is not every Palestinian is responsible for the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or the different organizations in between. And by having this by humanizing each side, we can eventually try to have a new government, an Israeli government and a Palestinian leadership that do see eye to eye and understand that each other are not the enemy, but the solution, that's where I think see things changing. Because at the moment, each side is incredibly upset at one another due to the different leaderships and how they presented the conflict. And so suddenly putting away all these different physical barriers from one another is only going to lead to a lot of death. And personally, I don't want to see more death because I've seen enough photos of it and it's horrific.
I just want to say something about to answer something you just said, Tal. It's my analysis. Listen, I'm not saying I have a solution to this, but I think that's the way things are right now. I don't think, of course, we all want change and we want peace. I don't see peace happening, very honestly, in the future for a reason that is linked to the situation partly in Gaza, actually. You mentioned Adar multiple times. 15 years ago, Hamas was, we evacuated in 2005 Gaza. So 16 years ago, that's when almost half of the population of Gaza last saw face, on a not through the security fence, an Israeli. Because today, how people in Gaza are seeing Israelis through the security fence and in uniform. They never get to meet us, in the streets of Tel Aviv, or even, like when Israelis could go to Gaza or and vice versa, right? That never happens. There's no exchange. The same way, like I have never met someone from Gaza my whole entire life. It's very hard to make peace like that, right? Because you don't know just who those people are. Forget, there was a time when there were more exchanges just because there wasn't a fence, it was an occupation. I'm not saying that's not harsh; it's terrible. But, like we're not seeing we're not seeing each other today. I've met Palestinians from the West Bank, and both as when I was serving and when I wasn't serving anymore. And it's a whole different thing, it humanizes them way more than for me the people in Gaza. Not saying that I dehumanize the people in Gaza. I don't, but I also think that when you look at the French-German history, for comparison, they had 3 wars and major wars, right? Especially the last 2, First World War, Second World War. We all agree those are terrible, right? The reconciliation, the peace process, if you want, happens when the man like de Gaulle, who embodied, right, the resistance, was still alive, and he's the one who made that step forward towards the German, right? I think Rabin was the man because he was the chief of staff during the 6-Day War when the whole occupation started. He was the man to bring forward the end of the right? But that chance got stolen. You may agree or not agree with Rabin, but I think he was the person because he was in charge when the whole started. And I don't see just peace happening because it's so also remote, and the cycle just keeps making it work.
Can I maybe circle this back and say that part of the reason, another reason that we're having trouble moving these 2 very immovable camps right now is because of the reason that we're doing this video, because of misinformation, because of the fact that people are trying to prove principled points by selecting evidence that is either not there or, like, again, this all comes down to the very simple facts that there are things about the situation that can be true and information that can be factual, regardless of the side that it benefits and whichever narrative it serves, right? And I think that most of the people here, we've all had an opportunity to recognize throughout this conversation when that's the case, when facts align in such a way that it very much supports maybe either the premise or even the actual claim that Abby Martin and people who think and analyze in the way that she does want to make about Israel's responsibility in fixing the problem in Gaza in whichever way that manifests. And we can also recognize the fact that if we lay out information such as the fact that the definition of a war crime is something that's actually important and shouldn't be used with infinite flexibility, because otherwise it becomes really hard to deal with real war crimes in places where that are happening, including Gaza, including Israel, including Syria, including Rwanda. Like there's some truisms here that don't really stop being true regardless of who they serve. And I think it's important to remember that. And that's something that, in a conflict like this one, only adds a layer of complexity. So I think that, the Israelis who, for example, would deny the Nakba, right? That doesn't help. And Palestinians who will insist that, the entire Jewish presence in this land is artificial and fabricated and a conspiracy, is also not going to help. Like there's something broken.
Right. Yeah.
I have a good question here by Aaron again.
Yeah, I just wanted. Okay, you did it.
Oh, sorry. I just thought it was a really good question.
Yeah, no, all good.
Do you think that because some of you come from the United States, that you have different perspectives on this topic than most people born here? I'll go first. I personally grew up most of my life here, but of course I'm not originally born here. I think I can detach a little bit more the emotional side, simply because I have had other perspectives not living in this country my entire life. I think because a lot of people, they're very, this is where they were born, this is the only place they have for them, Israelis and Palestinians, then it doesn't matter all the logic and all the laws and all the history, they're here and that's it. So I think the perspective is going to be a little bit different. But I think I do believe that some of the things that I'm saying come from a point of trying to put into a more logical fashion the emotional sides that a lot of Israelis and Palestinians, not Palestinians, of course, I can't speak for them, but the Israelis here, what they're trying to actually say to the world. Anyone else?
I mean, for sure, being born and living the first 18 years of my life in the United States had an impact on how I view the world. But I don't know if there's something about the United States that contributed to my views that would just be across the board to anybody living in the United States. Because if you look at like the views of, I guess you could say my views are probably more common in the United States. Yeah, that's fair to say. But you have some of the like very far right reactionary types who are American Jews, and then you have very left wing people who are born and raised in Israel, right? Like, and even some anti-Zionists born in Israel. So at the end of the day, it definitely played into something, but I don't know what specifically I could point at to, and how it affected my perspective.
As the only non-American here, can I point out to what you guys have in common? Because I can see it from, being French and having a different culture. For you Americans, the Constitution and, the 10 Amendments are such an important part. It's what makes everyone in the States an American, no matter where they come from. The belief in that document. It's very profound. I can hear it when Tal talks about, freedom and the movement. I can hear it, Adar, when you talk. And Ari, of course, I know you from before, and so I know, I know you love that document, right? So I think that this is something. Talking from the French perspective, I would say that most of the American people I've met here, they have this idea of freedom and the way they perceive the conflict. Of course, I've met some right-wing people that deny, American right-wing people that deny even the existence of the Palestinian people. But I think that you all agree, freedom and human rights, those are important things for you, right? Or am I completely mistaken? I completely misunderstand Americans.
I don't think that you're wrong. I think that the short answer to the question that was asked is yes, obviously, where you come from influences your opinion. And like, the ways that it does that might be tangible. But for me, I think that they're a lot more intangible. I think that a lot of us come from very mixed backgrounds and identities. So it's hard to attribute that just to the United States.
Right. But you have a different emphasis than Russians, for example, Israelis of Russian origin. Very different.
Probably.
For sure.
It is, yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Yeah.
Is it good? I see.
Maybe if you'll see other good questions, Jason's saying some funny stuff that we could engage with just for fun. Jason's asking. We'll do one. He's asking why I didn't speak this much when Noam Chomsky was on, and he thinks that the reason I was more quiet when Noam was on is because he would just straight up debunk my nonsense. That's essentially Jason's position. Well, Jason, brother, I sometimes moderate. When I moderate, I don't speak much. I just moderate. It's not really my job to share. So that was a situation in which I was moderating. When it comes to my thoughts on Noam Chomsky, I respect Noam. I had a one-on-one interview with him as well. I agree by and large with his criticism of Israel as well. I did, however, end the episode with asking him the question of what he thinks can be done, exactly the little monologue I went on, that people who say it's all on Israel generally don't provide solutions. Well, I asked that question to Noam, and you could look back. It's the last question Noam got asked. He didn't give a good answer. Maybe he was out of time, but most people who put it all on Israel don't go much farther than just putting it on Israel. I stand by that. I'm constantly looking for solutions because I put most of it on Israel, not to blame Israel, but because I actually want to solve the conflict. That's what we're here to do. So we're very much solution oriented, and it's very much true that most people who say it's all in Israel do nothing beyond that to actually provide a viable solution, aside from something that's akin to the destruction of Israel or something that will likely lead to genocide of the Jewish people living here. So,
So here's a really good question by Jared Winston. Does the panel believe that a major aspect of a peaceful solution would necessarily involve international intervention? If anyone wants to take it first, who knows, but I have an idea. I honestly, in just one sentence, is that I think international pressure can be really good, but not if they have external interests at hand. If they're doing it because they want a certain solution because it helps them, for example, when the British and the French were Sykes-Picot Agreement, when they were splitting up the region, they weren't doing it really according to the different cultures and the different clans. They were doing it according to oil and resources. So I think if an international body is going to be putting pressure on Israelis and Palestinians to get to a resolution, they should be doing it because they actually want to solve it, not because they want to be able to pin it on their Wikipedia that they solved the conflict.
I think that there's something else which is important about this, which is, when you say international intervention, that when you say intervention, most people's ears perk up and you think military. So that's one. I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's something to consider. And I don't think that a foreign military intervention would help jack shit in this particular context. I think that if you want to ask about the international community and their role in helping to resolve the conflict, look, there's two separate conflicts going on simultaneously. There's what you would call the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is between Israel and the wider region. Right, the history, 1967 war, 1973 war, 1948, all those things. There's the Arab-Israeli conflict, there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the two are very much intertwined. Now, traditionally, the approach to solving, the approach to addressing these conflicts is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is assumed to be the root of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Ergo, it needs to be negotiated and settled on a bilateral basis between these two parties before any other resolution can take place. That idea started being challenged in the early 90s with the Madrid Peace Conference. And also, important to note, the Madrid Peace Conference was the first time that Palestinians were ever brought to the negotiating table as a self-representing entity, right? So it's a big step in that direction. Now, whether or not the international community is going to be a thing that makes or breaks solving this conflict, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that they're certainly in a position to help. I can imagine that if we, maybe through the relationships that Israel is building in the Gulf and through all these other places, we can find a way to make Israelis more comfortable with certain concessions. We can find a way to create more development and foreign direct investment opportunities in the West Bank and Gaza. We can start to really get into these issues. But I think that the international intervention aspect of it really needs to be regional and not global, because the more we have people who approach the conflict, let's say with a value system, a knowledge base that is not adapted to this region, the worse things tend to get.
Right.
I've heard of a former Israeli diplomat I won't say his name, but he told me once he had a very original solution. He was like internationalize the old city of Jerusalem, and already you've made 50%, 50% jump forward towards the solution. I'd say that, I'd say it sounds crazy, but after the past 12 days now, I think that, Jerusalem is probably, of course, Jerusalem is at the heart of the conflict, right? So having so many, religious and different faith in one tiny spot, it's like being in the eye of the cyclone, of the storm. So yeah, if you make it international, you take the responsibility of the Palestinians, you take off the responsibility of the Israelis. At least that you don't have that point of contention anymore between the two.
Should I get into controversial territory?
Why wouldn't you?
Should we? Okay, fine.
Look at the type of channel you're asking.
Yeah, I might upset some people with this one, but Jason wants to know, our buddy Jason. I did see you promoting Khazar theory. It's a signal of something else, but I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Jason asks if I would call Israel a Jewish supremacist state. I don't use that language because it's highly inflammatory to Israelis, and my goal is to bring Israelis and Palestinians together. So I generally try to use language that can explain concepts without being unnecessarily inflammatory. But I would say the description of Israel being a Jewish supremacist state is accurate. Now, it's accurate, but it doesn't necessarily give the right impression because minorities in Israel have equal rights to Jews. The reason I'd say it could still be classified as a Jewish supremacist state is because it's a state that is explicitly Jewish. It says it's a Jewish state. Only Jews have the right of return. There's organizations. Well, I don't want to talk about organizations because that's not on a state level. But I would say, yes, that claim could be made. It just doesn't give an accurate description of what the reality on the ground is. In reality, minority rights in Israel are probably the best in the region. Minorities living here are, by and large, happy. What we did see last week with mob violence was troubling and definitely exposed the vulnerability in society that needs to be addressed. So yeah, I'd say it is an accurate description. It just is not such a useful one. Maybe in some contexts it could be useful, but I don't use it. I hope that answers your question. The panel might not agree with me, but yeah, feel free to push back.
I don't want to give him any more attention at this point. I've exhausted so much attention on him at this point,
I think he called me.
Actually, wait. Hold on, because I did say something that could be misinterpreted. Ahmad, you're right to say equal rights. Palestinians living as Israeli citizens have equal rights. All of the Israeli minority groups that have citizenship have equal rights. If you want to compare Palestinians living in the West Bank to Israel, then absolutely not. Then we have a different set of laws. And I would say even the use of the term apartheid has merit. Okay, so for sure. When I say equal rights, I'm talking about people who hold Israeli citizenship do have equal rights to Jews, for sure. Yeah, Walter, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, Jason, the one we do not name. As I think he told me Mizrahi, Jason, just for clarification, even though I'm a bit sad, I'm not Mizrahi. To my great regret, great music. But I guess I'm just wanted to precise that because when we were talking about Americans, they say Mizrahi doesn't understand civic nationalism. Yeah, I do understand it, Jason. I come from France. We have civic nationalism here as well.
Cool. We're already going on 2:30. I guess we'll wrap it up at 2:30.
If anyone has any more questions that revolve around bias, stuff like that.
We'll do 2 more questions. Jason, I'm sorry we've answered enough of your questions for the day.
There was
You want
a
to come back?
question way earlier on the feed, but that was a great one. How would we have reacted to Hamas rocket fire if we were in charge? That was an interesting question.
Really good question. I don't know who said that. If they could say in the chat, that's an amazing question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't note the name. I read the question. I was like, oh my god, that's like a cool question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Here, I think it's the $5 shake.
That's
I
an
don't know if I
expensive shake.
pronounced that. What?
That's an expensive shake.
Yeah.
Not in Tel Aviv.
No, that would be a cheap one. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Yes. I thought that was an interesting question. I don't know what you think. But,
Ahmad's asking a question that's about rights of access to the land and everything. And if you're talking about like within 1967 borders, there's a Supreme Court case in Israel that's about this. It's Adallah versus Walter. Maybe you remember. I don't. There's a Supreme Court case that basically guarantees the Arabs can live wherever they choose in the land, including in mixed communities or in Jewish communities as well. But there's a Supreme Court case that adjudicated that. I want to say in the 90s, maybe in the early 2000s, though.
it does sound like a 90s court decision.
No, it was in the part of the wave of the Constitutional Revolution and everything.
Yeah.
So.
I'm not sure.
I don't know much about that law. That's interesting. We should look into what that says. What I do know is that there is a law that allows for, you could call it cultural homogeny, where the majority population in the town can decide who gets to live there. Now, this is actually also beneficial. And again, if a Palestinian Israeli wants to come on and make a counterclaim, I'm very much open to hearing it. But from my experience, this benefits Palestinian Israelis. It protects against gentrification, essentially. So Israel has a very interesting form of coexistence that I think by and large works. When you have people of different cultures and backgrounds, religions coexisting, sometimes the best way to do it is not for everybody to live in the same city, but for them to live in neighboring towns with one another. We can work together, we shop together, but you still have your town with your own culture, your own customs, and this very much works in most parts of Israel. I live in the north. I live in a Jewish town. 5 minutes away, there's a Christian Arab town. 5 minutes away, there's a Muslim Arab town. There's a Druze town. So it's a very diverse place. Harmony across the board. Everybody's friends here. We get along great, but we have our own towns, right? So it's different than the Western concept of diversity, where you think everybody is just intertwined in one city block. But it works, and I can see how a law of letting the people of a town decide which ethnic group is allowed to move in can be abused and ultimately harm people. But I think there's actually something beneficial to a law like that. And I think that Palestinian Israelis actually appreciate that law as well. Again, if somebody wants to come on and make a counter argument, I am open to hearing it. But from my experience, that's how it seems to play out.
My only, it's not a counter argument. My only criticism of what you say is a great way is that the children do not go to school together. That is, for me, that is like a major issue. It's one of the big issues in Israel for me.
That you think we should have one schools, and this would include ultra orthodox as well, studying with secular.
Again, I don't have the solution. If I had the solution to a Palestinian conflict, I would go to Stockholm immediately and pocket $1 million.
On this topic, though, Walter, like what you just suggested exactly, the Israeli State Comptroller just released, I think it was about a week ago, a report that is looking at the Ministry of Education. Basically, the Ministry of Education in as early as the 90s put together an anti-racism like diversity inclusion way before, this actually became popular, in the West.
Yeah.
They put together this sort of plan for how to do this amongst the Israeli school system, because the Israeli school system is sectarian in the sense that you have, Arabic language, national religious, national secular, and the Haredi sectors. And there are supposed to be these meetings and these interplays and stuff. And one of the things that the comptroller said is that while there's a lot of progress in terms of the content that people are learning, meaning that Israelis are actually above the OECD average in terms of learning histories of other peoples living in Israel. So, for example, like Arab Israelis will learn a lot more about Jewish history, and also Jewish Israelis now in their textbooks, to the chagrin of many right-wing Israelis, learn about the Nakba and things like that, for instance. So like the content is there, but the meetings are not. And the meetings are actually something that would really foster that. And I think that also language acquisition is a huge part of it. I think more Israelis need to take the time to learn Arabic. I think it would change a lot. It would definitely counter misinformation that you have on social media that was fueling a lot of the violent protests that we were seeing within Israel over the last week or so. And I think that, they need to be, I agree with you, Adar, that like having that space to sort of hold on to your culture and retain it is really important, but also interacting and understanding not what coexistence looks like, what partnership looks like is a lot more important.
We kind of skipped over the question. He asked it again. $5 shake. He asked, if you guys were the Prime Minister of Israel, how similar or how differently would you have responded compared to Bibi? There's a few things to remember. I think the question depends on if you're saying that I'm in control of how the government is, or I simply switched Netanyahu. Because we have a coalition government, it's not as simply as what I want to happen. It also depends on who's.
I think he meant though control. That's good to point out.
Saying,
but yeah,
not everyone here understands how the politics here works.
Right.
So I'm saying it's not. But if I personally was in control, I think that Israel has a lot of short-term solutions for long-term planning. I think that what happened, the demands from Hamas were that we should have removed the police presence, and what was happening in Shikha with the evictions. It's a debate of whether it's legal or not legal. I don't understand the legal issues with it, so I'm not going to comment. But I think that what Israel should have done instead of just ignoring it and letting it happen is that we should have came with some type of counteroffer. Whoever doesn't know, there are 2 bodies of soldiers that are currently still being held by Hamas. But the more issue is that a few years ago, there was a mentally ill individual who accidentally crossed into Gaza. And he's currently been missing for almost 6 years now. Nothing, he's just a regular civilian. He was mentally ill, crossed into Gaza, not even like an Israeli with a conscious mind or a soldier, just some mentally ill person. And I think a very equal demand, if not the bodies, then that in return for the mentally ill individual, Israel would remove its police presence and stuff like that. And I think that could have avoided a lot more issues. That's personally how I would have done it in the beginning. I think that could have avoided a lot of the confrontation.
anyone else want to give it a go?
I don't want to be Prime Minister. That's
Ever worst nightmare.
It's the worst job ever. Like of all the heads of state to become, I don't think that you'd wish the head of state of Israel on your enemies. Like it's a position that is not enviable.
I'll answer briefly. I mean, I've done this on record so many times, but I'll give it one more go. And I want to wrap it up with doing like a TLDR of debunking Abby Martin. So if someone here, while I give this last response, maybe you want to organize it in your mind, how to explain Abby Martin, where she went wrong in the different areas in like a 3-minute summary. So if people don't want to watch the entire hour debunking, they could see at least like a 3-minute explanation of where she went wrong. We'll clip it and upload it individually. So I do not support Israel's retaliation of Hamas the way it's currently done. I think that our retaliation, if we look at what we know happens, right? So let's first look at the benefits, the strategic benefits in Israel's eyes. We do know that we affect Hamas capabilities, right? We kill their military personnel. We damage their infrastructure. We destroy some of their ability to shoot rockets. We destroy some of their rocket supply, right? That could be seen as a strategic win. It's also said to be a deterrent against retaliation. But if we look at what else happens from these attacks, I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that it's not actually a good deterrent, and long term, it's not net positive, these retaliations. So our strikes make Hamas more popular in Gaza. They make Hamas more popular in the West Bank. They make Hamas more popular in the international community, while they make Israel less popular in the international community. Not only that, but it causes the deaths of civilians. Children actually die from our retaliation, and that's something that should not be taken lightly. And not only are people killed, but it traumatizes pretty much every Gazan to go through that. The people we need to make peace with are further traumatized by our actions, right? So it seems short-sighted. Now, knowing all this, why does Israel still retaliate? They very well may see it as a good deterrent, and they very may well want to hinder Hamas's military capabilities. But we need to also be honest about the fact that not retaliating is essentially political suicide. Now, this isn't only true in Israel. Most countries, if not all countries in the world, would expect their leaders to harshly strike back if rockets were being indiscriminately shot at them, right? This isn't unique to Israel. So politicians, and this is a flaw in democracy, are looking how can they get reelected, not how they can create long-term solutions. So it's not hard to understand why Israel retaliates the way they retaliate. Politically advantageous for the leaders, may act as a deterrent, hinders their capabilities. But if we look at it long-term, it seems like Hamas is perfectly fine with this because it makes them more popular. They get funding from the international community to rebuild. It makes us look bad. So again, I think if you look at it in the big picture, it's net negative. It's not worth the cost of human life. It's not worth the benefit Hamas gains from it. I think we need to try to construct ways in which Hamas rocket fire makes Hamas less popular. So there's a few ways we could do this. One, we make a deal with the international community. Israel says we change the retaliation policy under the condition that rocket fire will be met with strong international condemnation and sanctions being put into place if rocket fire is shot. This is a deal I believe Israel can make with the international community. In addition to that, Israel lets around 7,000 to 8,000 truckloads of goods into Gaza every month. If rockets are fired, Israel shuts down the border entirely. It's true that this has the potential to contribute to a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, but it's way less severe than actually bombing the shit out of Gaza. We close down the border, let's say for a week, and then we drop leaflets over the Gazans saying, "Dear people of Gaza, we're sorry we had to close the borders. It's not our intention to hurt you, but your government has shot rockets to intentionally kill our civilians. We hope for one day to have peace with you, where you can travel freely to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and we can travel freely to Gaza City. Perhaps even drop care packages." This might sound crazy, but follow along. If we can create a situation where their rocket fire isolates them, not only internationally, but from their own people, and ultimately long-term weakens them, it will disincentivize them from such actions. I think currently we incentivize them in doing so. Last but not least, Israel should be dedicated to getting back to the negotiating table and solving this conflict not on the battlefield, but through negotiations. Hamas is, again, not shy in their aspirations to destroy Israel, but I think given the right conditions, given the right pressure, that we can even make a deal with Hamas. It wouldn't be the first time in the world in history when a terror organization became a legitimate government. So that's how I view it. These views are considered naive to the majority of Israelis, without a doubt, but this is how I view things. I hope I answered your question. Anyways, if somebody wants to do a too long didn't read of, just a summary of the debunking, and I love that my little idea upset people on both sides. That's exactly what I was going for. Mission accomplished.
So if I want to jump in and maybe do a TLDR of what we were trying to do with this video, and before, everyone who loves Abby Martin and swears by her, is like, yes, this is you didn't actually prove your point. What we did is we looked at her recent video, which is examining the argument that Hamas uses human shields, which she claims is a false argument. And we show that in trying to make that point, of all the points that she could have made in support of the moral position that she is trying to underline, she made mistakes that in the context of journalism are really bad for everyone. And in the context of the Palestinian national movement and the struggle for Palestinian rights do not help. And if anything, make the conversation moving forward very difficult. Specific examples of that, because people were, asking where the specific examples, is when she claims that there's no video evidence of Hamas using civilian areas. We showed some of it. There's more available. We'll make more available as we finish this video. There, she claimed that, I'm trying to think, in addition to this, that there were no armed people or militants in the Great March of Return. Again, this is something that even Hamas acknowledged several times publicly. She did point out correctly when people posted misinformation on the other side of the equation too, and good on her for pointing that out. We need her to apply the same principle to herself. And that's what we were trying to get at. And the rest of the conversation was fascinating and hopefully moved us 1 millimeter closer toward untangling the biggest mess in world history.
I think I would sum up my point being that there are a lot of views as to how to solve this conflict. There are people on the Palestinian side who say that all Israelis, all Jews living here should just be killed or thrown out. There are people on the pro-Israel side who say that all Palestinians should be killed or thrown out. And these are sides that people hold. But that's not the solution. That's not the route that I want to go down. I mean, at the end of the day, one route or another is going to reign supreme. But I'm more to the route of trying to reconcile between Israelis and Palestinians and coming to a better solution, because every day that goes by that more people die is it's just another tragedy in this conflict. And going down the path of trying to reconcile, trying to oust government figures who love this conflict because it helps them with their own support and staying in power, it doesn't help us. And I think that if you're for peace and you're for peace which does not involve thousands to hundreds of thousands of people dying, then the route of fact-based analysis and trying to speak with the other side is the way to go, in my opinion.
I would say to Abby Martin, basically, it's okay to dislike Israel. It's even okay to hate Israel, and it's okay to choose to have to give a tone to your reporting that is anti-Israel. I mean, you're free to do so. But I think that if you're going to do that, I think that's the common theme among, like Ari, Tal, Adar, me. You have to do that based on facts, and you need to take facts from both sides. It's one thing to point out, the Israel failure or shortcomings when they try to either by mistake, either intentionally. I'm not here to determine that. Present something as happening in Gaza, and it's actually not from Gaza. So that plus, since I was asked to join this panel, for which I'm very honored and very thankful to you, Adar, because I knew a bit of international law. You really need, before you make big claims going international and being things being done by Israel being illegal and things being done by Hamas not being, being legal. Therefore, this is a problem because international law is a living, breathing, moving thing, and the laws of armed conflict are prone to evolve. It's very important to get your facts straight when it comes to international law, because maybe, just maybe, since there's so much practice going on in Israel, there may come a time when international will become, if you say everything is illegal, but things are still being done because, well, technically they're illegal. You're destroying, you're reducing the strength of international law, and then countries will just do illegal stuff and think, anyway, people are going to say it's illegal, and who cares? They say that. So please try, and be precise in your analysis.
Just a quick point before Adar. I see people saying that we're not saying that. We're not saying that. If you call for the carpet bombing or bombing of Gaza, you're calling for people to be murdered. If you call for Israel to be wiped out, you're calling for Jews, and specifically Jews, because you're not talking about the Arabs here, to be wiped out. So yes, if you have these ideas, then that's what you're calling for. So be aware of that. Don't try to mince your words by saying you're not. If you call for the carpet bombing of Gaza because you want to stop the rockets, you're calling for mass murder. If you call for the destruction of Israel and for Israel to be wiped out, you're calling for the massacre of Jews living here. Just be aware of that.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank the three of you, Tal, Ari, and Walter, for coming on and really giving a lot of clarity and great points and different perspectives on definitely a complex issue. My thoughts on Abby, I really don't know too much about Abby, but I very much think she and I have something in common that we both care about the Palestinian cause. I want, again, Abby, I'm inviting you on the show if you see this, but I also do value honesty and accurate reporting, not only as a virtue, but also as an effective way to fight for your cause. I think the more misinformation you spread, the less legitimacy you have, not only as an individual, but for the cause you're fighting for. And this isn't only a message to Abby, this is anybody out there. We often feel like our backs are up against the wall. We feel like the world is against us. This is something that both Palestinians and Jews feel as well. People are saying, why would Jews feel like their back is against the wall? They have privilege. That's like an often, that's a common claim. If you look at what's happening in the diaspora, Jews are being attacked just for being Jews right now. So when we feel like we are being attacked and we're on the losing side of things, it is often natural to resort to tactics that might not seem completely honest or ethical. I want us to resist that urge and remain true to what we know to be right and ethical. So those are my final thoughts. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for the question and the commentary in the chat. Next week, we're going to debunk a pro-Israel video or an anti-Palestine video, depending on how the video is framed, but it's going to be taking something on the reverse side of the aisle. If people find good videos that you think we should debunk, send them in. We want ones not made by certain fringe people, but by influential people. These are the people who we would rather hold accountable for their misinformation. And yeah, much love. Signing out, friends.
Thank you.